Did you ever wonder how humanity got to where it is today? While it's easy to think of technological progress as a series of deliberate incremental steps, this is not always true. For instance, it only took 66 years for us to go from the first powered flight to walking on the moon. Before that, tens of thousands of years passed between the emergence of spoken language and the invention of writing. The point is that, as it turns out, progress does not move at a constant speed. What it does do is build upon what came before it, branching out from the simplest tools into the most complex technologies you can imagine. Every tool we touch today belongs to a single, unbroken lineage. And for the first time, we've compressed every technological advancement in human history into a single video. If you've ever played a video game like Civilization or Age of Empires, you should be familiar with the concept of a tech tree. You start with basic abilities that allow you to solve immediate tasks. Over time, new options unlock, allowing you to upgrade your efforts. Some of these upgrades lead forward, while others branch sideways. Some paths seem to spring out of nowhere due to a revolutionary discovery, while others dead-end or morph into something else entirely. But outside of games, tech trees are not abstractions. They are actually a perfect representation of how our reality actually works. Because while it's easy to see the human technological journey as a simple list of dependencies, it would be more accurate to describe it as a roadmap of dependencies. Like a real tree, the inventions and discoveries that took us from the Wright brothers bike plane to Neil Armstrong form a living structure, one that shows how knowledge, tools, and systems emerge from those that came before. This is critical to understand because technology didn't just shape civilization, it shaped us. When early humans learned to control fire, the change was not limited to warmth or light. Cooking unlocked more energy from food, allowing humans to absorb calories more efficiently while spending less time chewing and digesting. That surplus energy helped fuel the growth of the human brain, an organ that consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy. Bigger brains enabled more complex social behavior, better tool-making, and long-term planning, and that in turn created the most critical feedback loop in Earth's history. Smarter humans made better tools rewarded intelligence, and so, intelligence became a survival advantage. From that moment on, each new tool functioned as an evolutionary upgrade. Only this upgrade didn't require us to wait for our genes to change. In fact, by the time agriculture and metallurgy emerged, humanity had effectively outsourced adaptation to its own creations. Today, with the dawn of AI, that effort is poised to reach an even bigger milestone. From this point forward, we're going to stop thinking in years and start thinking in dependencies. Together, we're going to move through this tree the same way humanity did, from survival to control to abstraction, until we get to the point where technology actually begins to evolve itself. As we pass through the great eras of history, we will demonstrate how our rapidly approaching tech-driven future will not be built on just a handful of great inventions, but on layer after layer of decisions, accidents, discoveries, and feedback loops, all reinforcing one another across thousands of years. And where else would we start but at humanity's beginning? Prehistory. Humanity's technological story begins long before civilization, cities, or even permanent settlements. This was a world where every innovation emerged directly from the pressure to survive. For most of this vast span, humans lived as nomads, moving through grasslands, forests, coastlines, and ice age plains. But this new species was unique from those around it. Rather than adapting through the development of sharper claws or thicker fur, we adapted through ingenuity. And that ingenuity is what allowed us to drastically alter what it took to survive, and to teach others to do the same. By the end of prehistory, Homo sapiens will have already mastered three things that would sustain every future innovation: control of energy, processing of materials, and social organization. Everything that follows grows from here. Control of fire, category, energy and materials. Fire was humanity's first great energy technology. Of course, at first, it was an enemy. Its ability to do harm caused generations of humans to flee from naturally occurring flames. But as far back as 1 million years ago, Homo erectus humans learned to tend natural embers sparked by lightning, feeding them fuel, sheltering them from wind, and slowly mastering ignition itself. This is evidenced by places like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where researchers have found burned bones and ash deep inside the cave, where it would be impossible for fire to drift in naturally. Once fire was controlled, it transformed life in ways that reached far beyond warmth and light. As previously mentioned, cooking made food safer and more digestible, unlocking more energy from the same resources and helping to feed the growth of the human brain. At the same time, fire extended human activity into the night, a time when our weak eyes typically left us passive and vulnerable. But the flames also helped push predators back, thereby increasing survival rates. But as important as these results were, fire's value goes even further. Without it, we may never have learned to manage smoke, charcoal and ash, some of the earliest forms of chemical experimentation. Early humans also began burning landscapes deliberately to encourage grass growth, flush game, and reshape ecosystems. Stone was heat treated to improve tool quality, the first known instance of material engineering. It seems the tales of Prometheus were correct. Fire, perhaps more than any other technology, allowed humanity to become the gods of their world. Stone tools, category, tools. If fire taught humans how to control energy, stone tools taught them how to shape matter. The earliest tools emerged almost accidentally, as sharp flakes struck from river cobbles. But over hundreds of thousands of years, accident gave way to intention. Humans learned fracture mechanics, which allows them to turn simple cores and flakes into hand axes, scrapers, burins, and finely shaped projectile points. Each of these extended human capabilities in its own unique way. Axes allowed for offense, defense, and construction. Scrapers allowed for processing hides. Burins could be used to engrave bone and wood, making decorations. As toolmakers experimented with different stones, they learned to source materials like flint and obsidian, which fractured more predictably. Then came hafting, enabling humans to attach their sharpened stone points to handles using resins, sinew, and fibre. These composite tools were more than upgrades. They were precursors to machines. Simple as they were, these tools externalized strength and precision. They encouraged humans to think mechanically, imagining force, leverage, and purpose outside the body itself. Every later technology, from metallurgy to robotics, inherits this logic. Hunting and gathering systems. Category: farming. For most of human history, survival depended on mobility. Small groups followed animals, tracked seasons, and adapted constantly to shifting landscapes. But as the populations of communities grew, they needed more reliable systems of food. The keyword being systems. Persistence hunting, coordinated drives, traps, fishing nets, and weirs reflected a growing understanding of animal behavior and ecology. This was soon followed by early food preservation, such as drying and smoking, which allowed humans to store calories beyond immediate need. As important as these protein-rich animal meats were, it was gathering that really sustained life. In most hunter-gatherer societies, plant food supplied the majority of daily calories. But it's important to note that this was a technological advancement, not random foraging. It required deep environmental knowledge about which plants were edible, when they ripened, how long they lasted, and how they responded to drought, frost, or flood. This knowledge was cumulative and generational. Meanwhile, processing mattered as much as collection. Many staple plants were inedible until soaked, ground, roasted, or leached of toxins. This eventually led to the invention of stone tools such as mortars, pestles, and grinders. Though it took thousands of years, the shift from reacting to the environment to actively managing it is what set the stage for domestication in agriculture. Adhesives and binders. Category: energy and materials. It was around the time of stone tool development that early humans discovered that plant resins, animal glues, and birch tar could be heated into powerful adhesives. It was these adhesives that made composite tools possible, as they allowed stone tips to be fixed to wooden shafts, but their use extended much further. As we'll see in a moment, humanity was beginning to design its first containers, and the addition of plant and animal glues enabled them to be sealed and waterproofed. Containers. Category: housing. Containers might seem like a rather obvious invention, but they completely changed humanity's relationship with time. Natural vessels made from gourds, shells, woven fibres, leather and wood allowed the food and water acquired from hunting and gathering to be stored and transported. With the aforementioned adhesives and sealants, humans could create water-filled containers that, when heated with stones, could produce boiling water. This made food safer and unlocked hidden calories from hard-to-eat plants. Textiles and cordage. Category: housing and clothing. Speaking of plants, another major technological innovation of this era was the use of plant fibres and animal hair to create cordage. Suddenly, previously unused resources could be woven into nets, baskets and bindings. The benefits were immediate. Cordage multiplied human capability, allowing loads to be carried, structures to be bound, and prey to be captured efficiently. The leap from netting to weaving likely occurred when cords were laid side by side rather than knotted at intersections. It wasn't a big leap for early artisans to see how interlacing horizontal strands through vertical ones could create a continuous surface rather than a mesh. Before long, this led to the development of early textiles, including the first clothing not made solely from materials found in the environment. This enabled survival across vastly different climates and paved the way for later weaving and loom technology. Shelters. Category: housing. Early humans first borrowed shelter from nature. Though the term cavemen has long since been dismissed, humans did indeed occupy caves and overhangs as forms of early shelter. But at some point during the prehistory era, they learned to build their own. The first structures were made from saplings, thatch, hides, and even mammoth bones. Not only did this help stabilize life, but it also reduced mortality from exposure and allowed longer stays in one place. Compared to open-air living, constructed shelters introduced privacy, storage, and social differentiation. Perhaps most important of all, it lays the foundations for what we today know as architecture. Fire-hardened ceramics. Category: energy and materials. Long before pottery, humans experimented with clay and fire. In fact, early fired figurines show deliberate heat control transforming soft earth into hard, durable material. The result? The first truly synthetic substances ever created. Ceramics took the benefits of baskets and containers and multiplied them exponentially. These vessels were hard, sealable, and resistant to moisture and rodents. That enabled long-term storage of grains, seeds, dried plants, fats, and fermented foods. But this came with some important caveats. Ceramics are heavy and breakable. You don't carry them far. Their adoption signals longer stays in one place and repeated returns to the same sites. This means that even without farming, humans may have stayed in one place simply to avoid having to move and risk breaking their pottery. Language. Category: information and media. While we may not think of it as technology per se, language not only fits the definition of extending human capability beyond biology alone, but it may be the best example of such a system. Before language, early humans were constrained to immediate perception. This limited them to what could be seen, felt, or reacted to in the moment. Gestures, facial expressions, and vocalizations enabled basic signaling, but these systems were limited in precision, scope, and memory capacity. The emergence of structured language fundamentally broke those limits. This opened the floodgates to activities such as teaching, storytelling, coordination, and planning. It also led to the first real organization of society, which made cooperation both predictable and scalable. Without language, every generation resets. With language, humanity begins to compound. Pigments and paints. Category: information and media. Long before writing or numbers, humans were still eager to make their ideas visible. One of the first ways this was done was with natural pigments, especially iron-rich ochre. These were ground into fine powders and mixed with water, saliva, or animal fat to create an early form of paint. Cave walls, bodies, tools, and portable objects quickly became the surfaces of choice. This was far from an accident or a trivial act. It required material selection, preparation, and intention. These markings were not decoration alone. They encoded memory, identity, and belief. while the repeated symbols created a continuity across generations while language was still in its infancy. In the tech tree, pigments represent the first external media. As the earliest ancestors of writing, they mark the moment when thought escaped the mind and entered the world as a lasting object. Ornamentation, category, information and media. As humans became better at making the things they needed, they began creating objects whose value had nothing to do with survival. Shell beads, carved bone pendants, and feathers were not worn for warmth or protection, but for meaning. In most instances, these objects signaled group identity, status, relationships, and belonging. What makes this so important in terms of the human tech tree is that ornamentation required abstraction. A shell was no longer just a shell. Instead, it became a symbol whose value existed entirely in shared understanding. This marked the emergence of symbolic economies, where meaning could be exchanged independently of utility. This route would eventually branch out into technologies like currency, fashion, ritual objects, and branding. It is the ultimate basis for economies based on trust, perception, and shared symbols rather than direct need. Calendrical proto-tracking. Category: mathematics. Survival depends on pattern recognition. This is true of all animals, but especially of human beings. So, as our brains grew and societies became more complex, humans began to notice how nature repeats itself. The phases of the moon, the return of seasons, and the migration of animals were all recorded on notched bones and carved stones, where the tally marks tracked days, cycles, and events. This was the first attempt to quantify time. More importantly, it's what allowed humans to anticipate the future rather than merely react to it. Calendrical awareness introduced the idea that the world operates according to discoverable rules, and that those rules could be modelled, remembered, and taught. In the tech tree, calendrical proto-tracking is the root of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture planning, and eventually formal record keeping. It proves that civilization not only depends on tools, but knowing when to use them. By the end of prehistory, humanity had already assembled a remarkable toolkit. Energy was being controlled through fire. Materials were being shaped through stone, fibre, adhesives, and heat. Food systems were starting to be planned and managed. Shelters and containers were stabilizing and centralizing life. Finally, information was starting to be conveyed through language, symbols, art, and timekeeping. From this moment on, humans would no longer wait for their bodies to change as a means of adaptation. Instead, they would actively change the world to fit their needs. The Neolithic Revolution. Across the Fertile Crescent, the Yellow River Basin, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, and parts of Africa, a number of unique populations independently crossed the same threshold, entering the Neolithic Revolution. Over the next 6,000 or so years, humans began transforming landscapes into designed ecosystems. As a result, nomadic movement slowed, forsaken in favour of life in permanent villages. The key factor in all of this was early farming. After all, once food could be grown rather than found, everything else began to reorganise around that fact. Populations surged, communities grew denser, and technologies shifted from tools that moved with people to systems that anchored people in place. Plant domestication, category, farming. The first major branch of the Neolithic tech tree is plant domestication. Around the world, agriculturalists began selectively replanting the most productive seeds from wild grains. In the Fertile Crescent, this consisted of wheat and barley. In East Asia, it was rice and millet. In Mesoamerica, it was maize. In tropical regions where cereals struggled, tubers such as yams and taro provided a reliable source of carbohydrates. Of course, all of this would have been impossible without earlier technologies like fire for land clearing, containers for storage, and digging tools for sowing and harvesting. This process was not immediately rewarding, and no doubt these early farmers were seen as madmen by some. The improved crops were shaped across generations, favouring larger seeds, thinner husks, and synchronized ripening. And while these traits benefited humans, they reduced the plant's ability to survive unaided. It not only tied the plants to humans and vice versa, but it also anchored people to the land and to new social roles, a fact that ties directly into concepts like cities, governance, and economics. Animal domestication. Category: farming. Running parallel to crops was the domestication of animals. Dogs had already been integrated earlier as hunting partners, but the Neolithic expanded domestication to sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. Just like in a video game tech tree, each species unlocked new capabilities, like milk for nutrition, wool and hides for textiles, traction for ploughing, and manure for fertilizing fields. Of course, there's no discounting the reliable source of meat. Unlike wild harvest, domesticated animals created renewable systems of food and labor, as well as portable wealth. Domestication began with taming, but it evolved into selective breeding, an intuitive form of applied genetics. Over thousands of years, animals were redesigned for docility, productivity, and predictability. This is what allowed herding to develop, which in turn encourages villagers to reorganize around pens and pastures. Farming. Category: farming. As plant domestication spread, it turned into what we know today as farming. However, this varied across populated regions, as each had to work with its own soil, plant types, and climate. Floodplain farming along the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus harnessed seasonal floods to deposit nutrient-rich silt. In mountainous regions, terracing carved entire hillsides into usable land, representing one of the first major feats of civil engineering. Irrigation canals and basins followed, marking humanity's first large-scale environmental engineering projects. With beasts of burden on hand, the farming tools evolved as well. Digging sticks evolved into hoes, then into the plow, which could be pulled by four-legged helpers. Each farming method represents a distinct regional branch of the same core technology, and proves that while innovation is universal, expression is local. Processing. Category: tools. Harvesting food led to surpluses that previous generations couldn't have imagined, but they also introduced a host of new problems. Grains had to be ground, milk had to be preserved, raw crops had to be made edible, durable and transportable. As humans experimented with tools and processes, they created new technologies on an almost constant basis. Grinding wheat resulted in easily storable flour. Fermentation allowed for the making of bread and beer, the latter of which predates recorded history. Cheese-making transformed milk into a stable, tradable good. These techniques manipulated time, temperature, and microbes long before the concept of chemistry existed. Due to the sheer volume of food being produced, processing tools evolved from small handheld mortars into stationary technologies that further tethered people to their communities. Storage. Category: housing and clothing. Surplus demanded containment. Granaries, silos, and sealed ceramic jars protected harvest from moisture, pests, and theft. While the ability to store food revolutionized humanity's diet, it also shifted the scales of power. After all, whoever controlled surplus controlled the village's survival. And so, granaries became the physical centers of the community, evolving into literal and figurative symbols of collective planning and security. Later, it will be this branch that feeds into technologies like trade, accounting, taxation, and administration. Houses. Category: housing and clothing. Settlement drastically changed architecture. In temperate zones, wattle and daub huts began to appear. In colder areas, pit homes were constructed to protect against the cold. Stone roundhouses and mud brick compounds emerged in the Near East and Anatolia, including sites like Çatalhöyük, where homes featured cooking hearths and multiple rooms. Aside from the obvious improvements in shelter, permanent housing introduced new concepts like private space, property identity, and even home decoration. Meanwhile, their construction projects required coordination and planning, leading to early specialization in carpentry, masonry, and labor management. Construction tech. Category: housing and clothing. Though not every settlement reached the heights of Çatalhöyük, nearly every culture saw its construction technology advance significantly during the Neolithic. Post and lintel framing standardized load-bearing structures, while the addition of lime plaster improved hygiene and durability. Finally, stone masonry and mud brick laid the groundwork for monumental architecture. Roofing also diversified, with some cultures opting for flexible thatch, while others used reeds to improve water resistance. While it was undoubtedly functional, architecture also developed into a symbol, a sort of visible record of technological order. Spinning and weaving. Category: housing and clothing. The Neolithic also saw rapid advances in textile technology. The invention of early looms stabilized threads, enabling the production of complex woven fabrics. Meanwhile, the development of felting techniques, where heat is used to bind fibers together, allowed wool to be compressed into a weatherproof material. Tanning, meanwhile, refined animal hides into durable leather. When combined with existing technologies like natural dyes, textiles suddenly had colour and meaning. Clothing therefore became identity, artistry and protection all in one. Counting and tokens, category, mathematics, measurement and standards. The development of surplus and trade demanded that humans think in more abstract terms. This wasn't exactly an easy jump to make, so for thousands of years, just like today, clay tokens were used to represent goods and quantities. These were the first coins, but they were also the first units of measurement. Eventually, sizes and weights were standardized to ensure fairness, serving as an eventual inspiration for mathematics, writing, bureaucracy, and information technology. By the end of the Neolithic Revolution, humanity had crossed an irreversible threshold. Food was not only being engineered, but the development of farms and advanced buildings had introduced the concept of ownership. Meanwhile, survival began to hinge less and less on the world around us, and more on our ability to maintain and expand our technological capabilities. But necessity wasn't the only mother of invention at play. Making survival easier also created room for free time, and so, humans began to apply their imagination to other, less vital pursuits. By 4000 BC, this would see the tech tree explode both outward and upward. Copper and Bronze Ages. If the Neolithic was the moment humans learned to engineer ecosystems, the Copper and Bronze Ages were the moment we learned to engineer matter itself. As we move forward, pay close attention to the branches associated with energy and materials. Its surge upwards is what eventually starts pulling the rest of the tree along with it. Across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, communities discovered that stone was not the final word on tools, or as could not only be broken open by heat, but with enough of it, they could be turned from liquid to solid again and again. That's how we learned that if you mixed the right materials together, you could create substances that did not exist in nature at all. It was the next step in our ever-present quest to dominate the world around us. Copper smelting. Category: energy and materials. Early metallurgists learned that heating copper-bearing ores with charcoal in enclosed crucibles could extract pure metal. This was a new type of fire, one that went beyond burning into the realm of chemistry. As oxygen was stripped away, impurities could be separated, and new materials would emerge in liquid form. This node required a stack of prerequisites, including charcoal production, the invention of bellows made from animal hide, and early mine prospecting. It represents a grand convergence between energy control, containers, and materials processing, and the result was copper. Once we had that, it was only a few short steps to creating alloys, each of which would unlock new materials. The most important of all was a mixture of copper and tin called bronze. This new metal held a sharper edge, was less brittle than stone, and could be melted and reformed with ease. That single advantage reshaped labour efficiency, trade value, and military power. Metal products. Category: tools, weapons, farming. Once metal could be made, the tools branch and weapons branch immediately diverged upward. But metallurgy didn't just upgrade existing tools. Rather, it created entirely new classes of tools with shapes and tolerances that stone can't easily sustain. It also unlocked what we today call modular thinking, making things like sockets, rivets, hinges, and standardized fittings possible. Casting methods. Category: tools, energy and materials. Casting turned metallurgy from craft into replication. Early artisans poured molten copper into open molds, which were simple depressions that produced flat tools. But bivalve molds, consisting of two shells, as the name implies, were able to reproduce more complex shapes far more reliably. Next came lost wax casting, in which a wax form is shaped, encased, melted out, and replaced by metal, allowing for detail that hammering could never achieve. While often lumped in with metallurgy itself, casting is actually what made metallurgy scalable. Once a shape can be repeated, production becomes organised, thus paving the way for the earliest forms of industry. Glass and faience. Category, energy and materials. Not all engineered materials were metals. High-temperature experiments with sand, lime and plant ash produced glass frit, a partially melted material that could be fused and moulded. Meanwhile, in Egypt and Mesopotamia, artisans discovered faience, a glazed quartz that imitated precious stones such as turquoise and lapis. These were early synthetic luxuries, resulting in new forms of decoration. More importantly, they were rare. As a result, glass and faience beads, amulets and inlays quickly became status symbols and in turn, a form of currency. Faience and glass workshops became proto-factories, often attached to temples and royal centres. Together they foreshadow everything from glassblowing to optics and beyond. But as pretty as they were, they couldn't approach the staying power of the world's most coveted metal. Goldsmithing. Category, energy and materials, information and media. At first, gold was prized for its malleability and permanence. These features made it ideal for adornment and later, currency. Throughout the Copper and Bronze Ages, artisans developed a range of new techniques for working with gold, including annealing, hammering and filigree. Eventually, the objects they produced became more than just decoration. Somewhere along the line, the shine of this new, precious metal became intrinsically linked to divinity, status and cosmic order. Gold, and to a certain extent silver, doesn't just store wealth, it communicates it. It is portable legitimacy. In the tech tree, goldsmithing is a precursor to both coinage and abstract wealth, in which value is detached from direct utility. Today, nearly the entire world operates in such a manner. The wheel. Category, transportation. Alongside fire and sliced bread, the wheel is often the go-to whenever someone wants to highlight an invention of great importance. However, you might not know that this technological advancement began in an unexpected place: pottery. The wheel likely appeared first as a potter's wheel, a tool for shaping clay, not for moving goods. However, the concepts of rotational symmetry and continuous motion clearly stuck out to someone. Before the wheel, people mostly used sledges dragged across the ground. At some point, someone realised, what if the rolling part stayed attached to the load? That insight produced the first wheel and axle system somewhere around 3300 BCE. We have pictographs from Mesopotamia showing carts, and even four-wheeled wagons, so it's safe to say that the idea caught on quickly, and the wheel introduced a whole new branch of the human technology tree: transportation. Boats and ships. Category, transportation. If wheels conquered land, ships conquered distance. The earliest watercraft evolved early, mostly in the form of woven reed rafts or dugout canoes. But as the concept of woodworking evolved alongside improved tools, humans began to develop plank-built boats with advanced mortise and tenon joinery. By the time textiles brought us sails, humans had found a way to reliably transport themselves and goods to far-off lands, and that's when trade began in earnest. Soon after, river and sea networks linked Egypt, Mesopotamia and the Indus, moving bulk cargo more cheaply than any overland caravan. This further contributed to the spreading of technologies, as ideas could now travel alongside goods. Measurement and math. Category, mathematics, measurement and standards. As trade and cities expanded, precision became even more important. By 2100 BCE, the Babylonians had already formalized a base 60 system that still shapes modern timekeeping and angles. Meanwhile, further west, Egyptian surveyors were using practical geometry to re-establish field boundaries after Nile floods. At trading hubs, counting boards and abati allowed merchants and scribes to manage transactions too complex for memory. While it might seem like mere tallying, the importance of math and measurement cannot be overstated. Indeed, formal math introduces universality, truths that hold everywhere, for anyone. In the tech tree, this branch is the computational bedrock of architecture, astronomy, engineering, and countless other sciences. Timekeeping. Category, measurement and standards. Throughout the Copper and Bronze Ages, humans made massive advancements in technologies that measured time. Observing celestial regularity led to the development of formal calendars, which blended solar and lunar cycles through intercalation. Sundials measured daylight hours, while water clocks tracked time indoors and at night using 100% natural means. As with other forms of math and measurement, the evolution of timekeeping helped move society from natural rhythm to artificial order. Farmers used calendars for planting, priests used them for festivals, and rulers used them to command labour. The clock becomes a social technology as much as a physical one. Writing systems. Category: Information and Media. The information and media branch reaches a new stage here: encoded thought. Cuneiform in Mesopotamia and hieroglyphs in Egypt began as systems of accounting, with pictographs and marks being used to track goods, taxes, and labour. But once symbols could represent more than objects, writing became language. This in turn led to the creation of scribal schools, administrations, and the world's first archives. It also led to the development of writing implements like clay tablets, styluses, and papyrus. The impact was massive. Ideas could now travel through time without mutation, allowing cultures to further compound. Architecture. Category: Housing and Clothing. Bronze Age cities rose as statements of organised power. Mud, brick and stone were shaped into planned layouts, accounting for things like streets, temples, and administrative centres. Builders refined post and lintel construction and developed proto-arch methods like corbel vaults, which replaced the tension of keystone arches with the reliability of compression. These new techniques allowed for the creation of larger, more impressive structures. Thanks to the incorporation of technologies like measurement and math, cultures began planning and building the first true monuments, including ziggurats and pyramids. Compared to Neolithic compounds, Bronze Age architecture expressed hierarchy and permanence. During this period, the city itself became a machine for managing people, resources, and belief. Advanced weapons. Category: Weapons. A rule that appears consistent throughout history is that if a technology can be used for warfare, it eventually will. The Copper and Bronze era certainly proves this. Over several thousand years, bronze daggers lengthened into swords and spears became more standardized. Weaponsmiths also developed composite bows made of wood, horn, and sinew, which delivered immense power from more compact frames. The wheel was quickly affixed to small horse-drawn sledges to create chariots, which sped up humanity's ability to wage war. Throughout all of this, defensive technology kept pace with scale armor, shields, and siege ramps. Compared to the previous tribal skirmishes, Bronze Age warfare was industrialized, planned, and often state-sponsored. By the end of the Copper and Bronze Ages, humanity's technology had stopped functioning as a collection of isolated tools and had begun to operate as a single, interconnected system. Energy and materials were no longer limited to what nature provided directly. Through metallurgy, casting, and synthetic surfaces, humans learned to extract, transform, and recombine matter itself. Tools and farming technologies no longer merely supported survival, but organized labor, multiplied productivity, and tied entire populations to complex chains of production. Meanwhile, transportation collapsed distances as roads and sea routes stitched regions together, moving not only goods but also ideas and other technologies. But humanity was just getting started. The next age would be even more resilient thanks to a single abundant material: iron. Iron Age and Classical. The Iron Age marks a decisive shift in the human tech tree. During the previous period, metallurgy had been rare and elite, and the items it produced were mostly fragile. Iron changed all of that. More importantly, unlike copper, it was virtually everywhere. This discovery shattered the Bronze Age monopoly on metal and rewired the balance of power, democratizing metal-based technology. But alongside this brutal new technology came a wave of other inventions, some of which still feel advanced by modern standards. Iron and the Bloomery. Category: Energy and Materials. The foundation of the Iron Age was the Bloomery furnace. Unlike later blast furnaces, the Bloomery did not fully melt iron ore. Instead, it reached temperatures high enough to chemically reduce the ore, producing a spongy mass of metallic iron mixed with slag. This bloom was then hammered repeatedly to remove impurities through force and heat. It wasn't efficient, but it was revolutionary. Iron was stronger, It held a better edge and allowed for heavier work. Also, as previously noted, it was abundant, and so the Bloomery quickly became the heart of village-scale industry across Europe, Africa and South Asia, anchoring blacksmithing as a central technological profession. Advanced construction tools, category tools. As iron spread, tools evolved from extensions of muscle into amplifiers of intelligence. One of the most important technologies was the lathe, which enabled symmetrical shaping and introduced precision machining. Meanwhile, the invention of screws and threaded fasteners allowed components to be assembled and disassembled, encouraging modular construction, while pulleys, cranes, and block and tackle systems multiplied lifting power. These mechanisms transformed geometry into motion, embodying applied physics long before physics existed as a formal discipline. Concrete, category, housing, and clothing. In the classical world, no material better symbolizes engineered permanence than Roman concrete. By mixing lime mortar with volcanic ash, gravel and water, Roman engineers created a compound that hardened even underwater. Unlike cut stone, concrete could be cast into any shape, enabling the creation of true arches, vaults, and massive domes such as the Pantheon, though it would not be constructed until the next era. Concrete completely revolutionized construction speed and scale, enabling structures to be built rapidly while enduring for millennia. This was materials science far ahead of its time, which is why it's still used almost identically today. Advanced engineering, category, energy and materials, transportation. Iron and concrete enabled infrastructure on an unprecedented scale. Bridges extended trade and military reach while aqueducts delivered water across vast distances using gravity alone. In more advanced cultures like Rome, sewer systems like the Cloaca Maxima revolutionized sanitation, extending urban lifespans in ways some societies would not discover for thousands of years. The fact that these systems did not function independently provides us with a direct line to modern civil engineering. Advanced mathematics, category, mathematics. Engineering matured alongside expansions in abstraction. During the Iron Age, Greek thinkers formalized geometry into logical systems. Euclidean proofs defined space with universal rules, while trigonometry enabled precise measurement of angles, distances, and celestial motion. Though machines were already a thing, figures like Archimedes took the concept even further, exploring the science behind levers, buoyancy, and equilibrium. The primary use of this new math was to develop principles for solving problems faster, more easily, and with less effort. The astrolabe, category, measurement and standards, information and media. The astrolabe represents a subtle but profound shift in the tech tree, portable knowledge. It combined geometry and astronomy into a single handheld instrument. By aligning rotating plates with the positions of the sun, moon and stars, users could determine latitude, local time and seasonal position. As a result, what once required extensive memorized tables or long observation could now be solved mechanically. And the results were earth-shaking. With the astrolabe, navigation no longer depended entirely on coastline familiarity or oral tradition. Travellers could simply carry the sky with them. Conceptually, the astrolabe also introduced the idea that the universe is a system that can be modelled and relied upon, making it the tech tree ancestor to virtually all navigational and astronomical tools. Hellenistic Automata, category, tools, energy and materials. The ancient Hellenistic world offered a glimpse of a future some of us still have yet to reach. In cities like Alexandria, tinkerers and mathematicians constructed machines powered by steam, water pressure and falling weights. This allowed temple doors to open on their own, statues to move, and water organs to play music without human intervention. Automata proved that motion could be programmed and that behavior could emerge from valves, gears, and pressure differentials alone. The machines embodied sequences. If this happens, then that follows. Though these inventions would not immediately transform industry, the ideas they contained would echo centuries later in clocks, engines, and computation. Advanced medicine. Category: medicine. The Iron Age and Classical era was all about systematizing what had previously been random. One of the biggest beneficiaries of this endeavor was medicine, and of course the patients. It was during this period that physicians began cataloguing treatments, comparing outcomes, and writing texts meant to be studied rather than memorized. Surgical instruments crafted from iron were sharper and more reliable, thus expanding what the human body could endure and recover from. Thinkers such as Galen attempted to model anatomy and physiology as interconnected processes, rather than isolated symptoms. In parallel, Indian centres of learning institutionalised hospitals and medical training, embedding care into social infrastructure. Though many theories, such as the balance of humours, were incorrect, the method mattered more than the model. Because of this period, medicine became about observation, documentation, and repeatable procedures. The body was no longer purely spiritual or symbolic. It was mechanical, chemical, and diagnosable. Without this idea, modern medicine would have never been possible. Advanced shipbuilding, category, transportation. Shipbuilding entered something of a golden age during this period. Iron tools dramatically improved timber shaping, while geometry refined hull design. The invention of rigging systems enabled the distribution of force across masts, sails, and hulls with greater efficiency. And so, like everything else, ships became systematized machines. Warships like the trireme balanced speed, maneuverability, and human power. Merchant ships scaled up dramatically, carrying bulk cargo across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, feeding into regional economies. Without these new advanced ships, many of the shared ideas that helped make the world would not have been possible. But the first age of exploration came with an important caveat. Deadlier weapons. Category: weapons. Once again, iron democratized everything, up to and including violence. Longswords, standardized spears, iron shields, helmets, and horse tack allowed states to equip large, uniform armies. Weapons not only became reliable, repairable, and replaceable, but specialized designs soon appeared. The Roman pilum spear had a strong iron tip but softer iron in the neck. It was designed to deform on impact, disabling enemy shields. In the event of a miss, the bent weapon would be utterly useless to the enemy. As warfare grew in scale, it became more about logistics than sheer numbers. With the right technology, smaller forces could accomplish incredible feats of violence. Mechanical weapons. Category: weapons. The Iron Age saw the first use of mechanized warfare as the art of combat incorporated the power of applied physics. Ballistae and catapults stored energy in twisted sinew and released it through controlled geometry, while trebuchets exploited gravity itself, allowing users to hurl massive projectiles with terrifying efficiency. These were mathematical machines, the results of calculations involving range, tension, projectile mass, and arc. And because of their power, walls stopped being symbols of safety. Now they were just another variable. Steel? Category: energy and materials. Through repeated heating, hammering, and quenching, early metallurgists discovered that iron could absorb carbon from charcoal. Not long before BCE gave way to the Common Era, the Iron Age gave us steel. This new metal was harder, more elastic, and far more resilient than wrought iron. In India, advanced carburization techniques produced Wootz steel, whose quality became legendary. Elsewhere, variations spread through trade and imitation, yielding blades and tools that retained sharp edges under intense use. Steel required precise temperature control and timing, and represented a breakthrough in humanity's ability to engineer materials superior to those found in the natural world. By the close of the Iron Age, the human tech tree had achieved an unprecedented synthesis. Materials were engineered rather than discovered, and the latest tools could not only amplify human strength but also human cognition. Most importantly, countless aspects of life were being systematized with remarkable efficiency. Infrastructure, mathematics, science, and medicine became focused on standardization, predictability, and interoperability. Though religion still dominated thought, humans were finally going beyond asking what works to asking why those things work. Yet this sophistication carried fragility. These systems depended on literacy, trade networks, institutions, and political stability. When those supports failed, complexity unraveled, and knowledge was scattered. During the next era, entire branches of the tech tree will go dormant, medieval and post-classical, Between 600 BCE and 500 CE, many of the great empires fractured. The Neo-Assyrian Empire fell first, followed shortly by the Babylonians, the Macedonians, and the Ptolemaic Kingdom. In 476 CE, the big one went the way of the dodo, as the Western Roman Empire finally collapsed, leaving only its eastern counterpart still standing. Amid the chaos and organisation, some technological growth paused entirely, while the rest was redirected towards what people needed most: food and stability. Despite the socio-political turmoil, invention never truly stopped. It just took longer to spread. Once it did, the world would wake up to find it had everything it needed to launch itself into one of the most prolific periods yet. The post-classical era is the more scientific term, but most of us know it as the Renaissance and later the Age of Exploration. Throughout this 1,000-year period, humanity would make some of its most important technological advances, while new empires formed from the ashes of the old. Heavy plow. Category: farming. Considering the Greeks were making automatic doors a few centuries before, it's hard to see the humble, heavy plow as a world-changing technology, but it was. In northern Europe's dense, clay-rich soils, older lightards simply scratched the surface. But the heavy-wheeled plow, fitted with an iron share and mouldboard, cut deeper and turned the soil over, aerating it while burying weeds. As the land became more productive, food yields rose dramatically. This completely reshaped European society, not because of the plough itself, but because of what it took to use it. See, the heavy plough was, as the name implies, heavy. As such, it required teams of oxen or horses to pull, which encouraged cooperative farming and communal coordination. Eventually, villages were reorganized around shared fields and shared equipment, and when those previously unfarmable northern lands became viable for agriculture, the population moved there in droves. Horse collar. Category: farming, transportation. To pull that new heavy plough efficiently, medieval Europe needed another key technology: the horse collar. Earlier harness systems pressed on an animal's throat, which caused them to choke under heavier loads. But the new padded collar redistributed pressure across the shoulders, allowing horses to pull dramatically more weight. Before long, they became the dominant draft animals of much of Europe. It might not seem like a massive shift, but because horses are faster and more versatile than oxen, the collar multiplied both agricultural productivity and transport capacity. The collar also illustrates a recurring theme in the tech tree. Sometimes progress comes not from discovering new energy, but from removing a hidden bottleneck that prevents existing energy from being used effectively. Medieval horsepower was not a metaphor, but a literal foundation of pre-industrial work. Three-field rotation. Category: farming. The next farming upgrade wasn't a tool, but a system. Instead of dividing land into two parts, farmers split it into three. One planted in autumn, one in spring, and one left fallow. This new innovation dramatically reduced soil exhaustion and maintained fertility through natural restoration, while increasing total yield compared to older systems. It also reinforced calendar-based planning, making farming more predictable and enabling larger surpluses. Those surpluses, in turn, literally fed everything else, from urban growth and taxation to armies and learning. From a tech tree perspective, three-field rotation represents the moment ecological management became a routine practice. Mills. Category: energy and materials. As food and textile production expanded, medieval societies began mechanizing labor using two of the most reliable elements at their disposal: water and wind. Watermills and windmills harnessed these natural forces to generate steady mechanical power for grinding grain, fulling cloth, sawing wood, and pumping water. Though they are almost antiquated by today's standards, they represent one of the medieval era's most crucial energy branch upgrades: power generation that isn't muscle. The earliest gears had been developed in the 3rd century BCE, but now they, along with cams and shafts, were being put to good work, harnessing rotational motion. And once the basic mechanical toolkit existed, it could be reassembled into many machines, each adapted to a local need. In time, each village became its own processing centre and economic hub, clearing the way for what would later become widespread industrialization. Irrigation wheels. Category: energy and materials, farming. Water wheels were perfect for moving other machinery with the power of water. Irrigation wheels focused on moving the water itself. Thanks to inventions like the Noria and Sakia, engineers could scoop water and dump it into canals or cisterns, irrigating fields above river level. This is one of the major medieval leaps toward automation, as the wheel runs continuously, performing repetitive labour without constant human effort. Compared with manual bucket irrigation, these systems dramatically increased reach and volume. More importantly, they expanded agriculture into areas previously limited by topography and stabilised yields by reducing dependence on rainfall. Advanced mechanical devices, category, tools, energy and materials. As engineers refined how motion could be transformed, controlled and measured, the medieval era's mechanical branch grew denser. Alongside gears and cranks, camshafts converted the rotary motion of wheels and mills into reciprocating motion, enabling the design of pumps and other rudimentary engines. This not only revolutionized the era, but also set the conceptual foundation for the piston-driven machines that would come centuries later. Finally came clock escapements. The mechanisms regulated gear movement, which allowed clocks to divide motion into precise intervals. By the end of the medieval era, mechanical clocks began appearing across Europe and China. These devices form a crucial tech tree bridge. Ancient automata demonstrated that machines could move, but it took medieval mechanisms to demonstrate that those machines could be regulated. Ultimately, it is control, not motion, that forms the prerequisite for engines, factories, and modern automation. Blast furnace, category, energy and materials. After centuries of using kilns and bloomery furnaces, metallurgy took another step toward industrial scale. Blast furnaces, appearing first in China and later in Europe, forced air into the smelting process, achieving temperatures high enough to produce cast iron. This meant that ore could be processed in large volumes and with greater consistency. Cast iron enabled the creation of durable plowshares, weapons, and architectural elements while making complex molds more practical. Compared to bloomeries, the blast furnace represented both a productivity leap and a conceptual one. It turned metallurgy into a sustained, controlled process rather than a single event. Paper, category, information and media. While machines mechanized labor, paper mechanized memory. Invented in China from ingredients like mulberry bark, hemp, and rags, paper was lighter and cheaper than parchment or papyrus. And as it spread through the Islamic world and later into Europe, it transformed administration, scholarship, and communication. Paper workshops standardized quality and process, turning writing material into a scalable product. For good or ill, this allowed for the expansion of bureaucracy and other institutions such as education. In terms of the tech tree, paper essentially revolutionizes the information and media branch while amplifying every system that depends on record-keeping, from law and trade to science and religion. Printing, category, information and media. Between the invention of paper and the invention of printing, thousands of people spent their entire lives making handwritten copies of essential texts. But the Chinese, who prized education and record-keeping, were intent on finding a better way. And so, they invented block printing, which allowed text and images to be copied from carved wooden plates. This dramatically accelerated the spread of information while reducing copying errors, effectively turning knowledge into something that could be distributed quickly and reliably. Put in context, printing did to information what mills did to grain. It multiplied output and reduced dependence on individual labour. In tech tree terms, it was the first step toward mass communication. Movable type, category, information and media. Less than 100 years before the medieval and post-classical period came to a close, a German man named Johannes Gutenberg built on Bischeng's idea of printed type to invent the era's defining technology, the metal movable type and press. As with many essential technologies we've covered, what made it so revolutionary was its approach to systemization. With the printing press, modularity was built into every aspect. Letters became reusable parts, and text became a matter of assembly. As in China, movable type allowed books, pamphlets, and technical manuals to spread rapidly. As a result, education became less exclusive, Literacy expanded and ideas began to travel faster than the institutions could control them. Magnetic compass, category, transportation, measurement and standards. The invention of the compass was a quiet doorway to the global ocean. Originating in China as a divination tool, the device had evolved into a navigational instrument by the 11th century, aligning human movement with Earth's invisible magnetic field. For the first time in history, humans could establish their direction independent of stars, coastlines, or clear weather. Like so many technologies in this tree, the introduction of the compass changed everything for virtually everyone. Suddenly, mariners could venture into open water with confidence, connecting distant shores into dependable routes. When the age of exploration arrived at the tail end of this era, the compass, along with our next technological advancement, was integral to the process. Lateen sail, category, transportation. Sails had been around nearly forever at this point, but the lateen sail represented a major upgrade. Unlike square sails that primarily pushed ships downwind, the triangular lateen sail allowed vessels to tack against the wind, and so sailing became less about driving and more about steering through invisible forces. This expanded trade networks and naval range, especially in the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, where variable winds demanded flexibility. The lateen also illustrates a recurring pattern in the tech tree. Mastery comes when a technology stops merely using nature and begins negotiating with it. That said, big ships that would define the second half of this era were still missing a few elements necessary to make their budding transatlantic journey. Sternpost rudder, category, transportation. To complete oceanic navigation, ships needed a better way to steer. The Chinese were once again the first to develop the sternpost rudder. However, Europeans quickly jumped on the bandwagon once word of the new innovation reached them. This new type of rudder was mounted directly on the rear of the hull, replacing side oars and improving both stability and maneuverability. It could also be scaled with ship size, allowing larger vessels to remain controllable without enormous crews. Combined with the compass and advanced sail plans, the sternpost rudder completed a triad of navigation upgrades. As course keeping became more predictable, long-distance travel became more repeatable. Of course, you still needed to know where you were going. Porcelain charts, category, information and media, measurement and standards. When compasses and steering improved, maps had to catch up. Porcelain charts were remarkably accurate coastal maps built from compass bearings and measured distances. More importantly, they incorporated a range of essential guides, such as wind roses, scales, and practical navigational details. This meant routes could be plotted rather than guessed. Thanks to porcelain charts, the world became less mythic and more measurable. On the tech tree, this critical node forms a junction between measurement and navigation, a marriage that would define the latter part of the era. Medicine theory, category, medicine. While old empires fell and new ones flourished, medicine continued to mature as a documented institutional practice. Many of the most important advancements came from the Islamic world, where the first state-funded hospitals began to appear, complete with trained physicians, pharmacies, teaching programs, and medical licensing. One of the most influential figures was Avicenna. His canon of medicine systematized anatomy, diagnosis, pharmacology, and clinical observation. Shockingly, it also described contagious disease, quarantine, experimental drug testing, and differential diagnosis, concepts Europe would not widely adopt for centuries. In Europe, medical advancement was far more uneven. There was learning and care, but it was constrained by limited institutions, religious frameworks, and heavy reliance on ancient authorities. The Black Death, which killed nearly 50% of the continent's population, didn't help, especially as local physicians were still relying on bloodletting, prayer, and astrology. They don't call them the Dark Ages for nothing. But eventually, as the late Middle Ages arrived, European medicine began to improve. This was partially due to a widespread desire not to lose the other 50% of the population, and the availability of translations of Arabic medical texts. Distilled alcohol became a reliable solvent and disinfectant, while advances in optics allowed for the invention of eyeglasses, likely between 1280 and 1300. Still, Europe had a long way to go, as 25 to 40% of all children died before the age of 5. Gothic Engineering, category, housing and clothing. They may not have lived long, but at least the Europeans had beautiful architecture to look at. Gothic builders introduced a plethora of innovations that ensured we can still enjoy their buildings today. Examples include pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses, which distributed weight efficiently while making cathedrals look incredibly imposing. Due to these innovations, walls could be built thinner and windows could grow enormous, with stained glass flooding interiors with light. These awe-inspiring edifices would never have been possible without centuries of accumulated craft knowledge. This is what enabled advances in structural mechanics and precision construction, which treat buildings as systems of loads and counterloads. Weapons 3. Category: Weapons. The plague was not the only cause of widespread death during the medieval and post-classical period. Weapon enthusiasts around the world developed a whole new ecosystem of specialized technologies, each engineered for a specific tactical role. The crossbow exemplified this shift. By storing energy mechanically rather than in muscle memory, it allowed relatively untrained soldiers to deliver armor-piercing force. This changed military organization. Armies could now be raised and equipped more quickly, reducing reliance on lifelong warrior elites. The longbow was the opposite. It requires years of training to use correctly, but rewarded that investment with rapid fire, long range, and devastating kinetic energy. Mounted warfare evolved in parallel. The stirrup stabilized riders, allowing them to transfer momentum through lance and sword without losing balance, effectively turning horse and rider into a single weapon. Armor adapted accordingly, evolving into articulated plates that distributed weight across joints while preserving mobility. Ultimately, medieval weapons did not necessarily overturn those of the Iron Age, but optimized them, with one glaring exception. Firearms, category, weapons, energy and materials. Gunpowder, first developed in China through alchemical experimentation, combined sulfur, charcoal and saltpeter into a substance that could transform stored chemical potential into explosive force. Initially used for signals and incendiaries, it soon found its most disruptive application in warfare in the form of what we today call guns. Of course, early firearms were crude, consisting primarily of hand cannons, bombards, and simple tube weapons. Still, their impact was immediate. For the first time, a weapon's power was not limited by muscle, leverage, or tension, but by controlled explosion. This forced metallurgy to evolve again, and gun barrels had to withstand internal pressure without bursting. Tactically, firearms destabilized existing military hierarchies, as armor that had taken centuries to perfect could now be defeated by a projectile weapon fired by a toddler. In the tech tree, firearms represent more than a weapons upgrade. They mark the first major intrusion of chemistry into large-scale weapons technology. Later, the same principles used to propel early bullets would be used to drive mining explosives, engines, and industrial reactions. By 1500, the medieval world had defied the odds, turning scattered inventions into new, scalable systems. Agriculture became more systematic and productive, while energy was harnessed and mechanized through mills, irrigators, and water wheels. At the same time, information began moving faster than ever before. Paper and printing transformed writing into something cheap, replicable, and widely distributable. This was helpful, as the new empires of the world were planning to use those shiny new boats to go to some pretty interesting places, and they'd need something to read along the way. Early modern. At first glance, there's nothing inherently modern about the early modern era, but the experts who divided humanity's timeline knew what they were doing. To them, this is the point where the human tech tree officially starts to behave like a single, accelerating system. Because previous inventions had made the world so interconnected, exploration, science, industry, and warfare were no longer advancing in isolation. Instead, they reinforced one another. Ships carried instruments that fed data to scientists, who refined mathematics to improve engineering. That engineering in turn helped to improve ships, weapons, and industry. And the best part is that all of it moved exponentially faster, because information itself could now be replicated and distributed at scale. Strap in, because the tech tree is about to go through a massive growth spurt. Big ships. Category: transportation. The 1400s saw plenty of big ships. After all, that century had ended with perhaps the most significant discovery of all, that of the Americas. Scholars will be quick to point out that the term discover is a bit Eurocentric, as Asian peoples had been living there for 20,000 years, and the Vikings had been there about 5 centuries before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Still, neither of those earlier discoveries sparked the rush for land and property like the latter did. With new land to plunder, European shipbuilders developed a new generation of vessels designed for sustained transoceanic travel. King among these new ships was the galleon, a floating fortress with multiple decks capable of carrying tons of gold and enslaved people, as well as waging war. These ships were not just bigger. They were integrated systems. Hull shapes were refined to handle long-term stress. Decks were reinforced and compartmentalized. Rigging became modular and repairable at sea. Meanwhile, cannon ports were designed into the structure, turning the ship itself into a weapons platform. In the tech tree, big ships are the physical backbone of globalization. Without them, everything else in this era stalls. Global navigation, category, transportation, measurement and standards. The compass had been a game changer, but the open ocean was so vast and the return trips so demanding that navigators needed to use every tool at their disposal. By the 1700s, navigators could determine latitude more precisely by measuring the angle of celestial bodies using refined instruments like the sextant. But longitude remained a problem until the development of accurate marine chronometers, which turned time into location. Scientific method, category, information and media, mathematics. Perhaps the most powerful technology of the early modern era was not a machine, but a method. The scientific method replaced inherited authority with systematic observation, experimentation, and replication. Claims were no longer accepted because they were old or prestigious. They had to survive testing. This drastically changed how discovery worked because it demanded that experiments be recorded and results be shared so that errors could be corrected by others. In short order, scientific progress became cumulative rather than cyclical. As science became more disciplined, scientists needed more controlled environments, and so observatories, laboratories and academies were founded to support this new, institutionalized precision. Modern astronomy, category, mathematics, measurement and standards. Astronomy was the first discipline fully transformed by the new approach to science. After believing that the Earth was the center of the universe, we finally put the Sun back on its pedestal with the heliocentric model. This wasn't a philosophical or religious argument, however. Instead, it was a mathematical necessity. As observations became too precise to ignore, we eventually had to admit that we couldn't possibly be at the center of anything. Moreover, Europeans found objective evidence to back up what the Druids and Egyptians had known for centuries, that the planets followed predictable paths. When Isaac Newton unified motion and gravitation, the heavens and the earth were governed by the same equations. The universe had become mechanical. Calculus, category, mathematics. By the 1600s, it became increasingly clear that the universe was governed by systems, and to describe these systems, complex as they were, a new mathematical language was required. Calculus emerged as a way to model continuous change involving things like motion, acceleration, growth, and decay. Differentiation describes how things change at an instant, while integration describes how small changes accumulate into wholes. Forces, curves, and flows could now be expressed precisely rather than as guesses. This was not just a new tool, it was a new way of thinking. Because of its invention, physics, engineering, and astronomy became equation-driven disciplines. This meant that structures could be designed before construction, and machines could be optimized before assembly. From the tech tree's perspective, calculus is the hidden engine beneath modern science and industry. Logarithms, category, mathematics. Even with calculus, computation was still slow and error-prone. Logarithms transformed calculation by compressing exponential relationships into linear ones. Multiplication became addition, and division became subtraction. This made measuring things like astronomical distances, navigational problems, and ballistic trajectories manageable with nothing but a brain, chalk, and a chalkboard. But in short order, someone would replace those as well. Slide rule. Category: tools, mathematics. The slide rule was as simple as it was complex. Two logarithmic scales slid against each other, allowing rapid calculation through physical motion. With this new device, engineers could solve problems by feel as much as by sight. Right up until the invention of the electronic calculator, the slide rule was standard equipment for scientists, navigators, and builders. Everything from bridges to ships to engines was built with it. One might say it was as responsible for the modern world as anything else on this list thus far. Optical glass and lenses. Category: energy and materials. By the 1500s, advances in glassmaking had produced clear, uniform lenses. Because of this, scientists were granted a window into both the greater and the lesser world. Telescopes expanded the universe outward, while microscopes revealed things that had been hidden from previous generations. The power of this single development is impossible to overstate. Without optical glass, everything we've learned about biology, astronomy, and chemistry since the 14th century would have never been discovered. Porcelain. Category: energy and materials, housing and clothing. The world may have been moving quickly, but it was by no means ignoring the finer aspects of life. Arts and crafts have evolved in numerous ways, and what better example is there than porcelain? Porcelain represents one of the most demanding material achievements of the early modern world, not because it was useful, but because it was precise. Like so many inventions of this era, porcelain was perfected in China, particularly at centres like Jingdezhen. It's notable because it required a level of control over heat, chemistry, and mineral purity that no earlier ceramic tradition had achieved. Kaolin clay had to be refined. Feldspathic glazes had to melt at just the right temperature. Kilns had to sustain extreme heat evenly for long periods without structural failure. This was materials science disguised as art. The result was a ceramic unlike any before it, hard yet translucent, chemically inert, resonant when struck, and resistant to cracking and staining. More importantly, its value reshaped global trade. European demand for porcelain, often called white gold, drained silver eastward and drove centuries of imitation attempts. Entire industries arose around trying and failing to reproduce it, and those failures mattered, because in trying to copy porcelain, European artisans improved furnace design, mineralogy, and chemistry. In tech terms, porcelain is known as a technological attractor, pulling multiple disciplines forward completely by accident. Improved metallurgy. Category: energy and materials. By the early modern period, metallurgy ceased being a craft tradition and began functioning as a proto-science. Blast furnaces were refined with better bellows, improved refractory linings, and more precise airflow control. Pig iron production became more consistent, and steel quality improved through new techniques like carburization, quenching, tempering, and annealing. Even more critically, repeatability increased. Metal could now be produced with predictable properties. That predictability unlocked new or improved products like gears, springs, and bearings, items where even minor deviations could lead to failure. After centuries of being haphazard, metallurgy had become reliable, laying the physical foundation for machines that could run continuously, be repaired predictably, and scale beyond artisanal limits. Chemical tech. Category: energy and materials, medicine. The early modern period marks the transition from mystical alchemy into a practical, experimental discipline. Matter was no longer thought of as being imbued with hidden essences, but like so many other things before it, as a system to be studied systematically. Because of these experiments, distillation became easier, while acids, alkalis, and solvents were isolated and catalogued. The standardization of glassware and tools helped to ensure comparable results across different locations. This standardization mattered more than discovery, because once reactions could be repeated, knowledge could accumulate. Firearms 2. Category: weapons. By the early modern era, firearms ceased to be experimental novelties and became standardized military systems. The matchlock was the first true step toward this maturity. Using a burning wick to ignite powder in a flashpan allowed soldiers to aim, coordinate timing, and fire in disciplined volleys. The wheel lock, a spring-loaded wheel striking a pyrite striker, pushed this further by replacing open flame with a mechanical spark. This allowed for the use of these new weapons on horseback and in poor weather. Finally, there was the flintlock, which was even more reliable, faster to reload, and, most importantly, cheaper. For nearly 2 centuries, infantry tactics, fortification design, and logistics reorganized around its capabilities. By the mid-18th century, the human tech tree had crossed a threshold it could not retreat from. Materials were no longer merely being shaped, but were being engineered for precision. From mechanics and metallurgy to chemistry and beyond, knowledge had become procedural. And since information was moving faster than authority could contain it, the entire world, including the one that had just been discovered, could profit from and build upon this knowledge. Around the globe, technology was now self-accelerating. Because of this, the branches of the tech tree not only blossomed but also became intertwined as discoveries in one area supported new discoveries in others. This feedback loop is the true engine of the modern world, and that engine is about to see use on an industrial scale. First Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution marks one of the most dramatic changes in the entire human tech tree. For the first time, energy itself had been mechanized, and with it, society was reorganized from the ground up. And so, what began in Britain as a regional convergence of coal, iron, capital, and skilled labor rapidly escalated into a systemic transformation. Production moved out of homes and workshops and into factories. Precision replaced intuition, while repeatability replaced craftsmanship. Perhaps most importantly, machines began building other machines, absorbing human labor into a deafening rhythm set by gears, pistons, and clocks. We weren't so much changing our environment anymore as we were building machines to change it for us. Coal, category, energy, and materials. Coal is the foundational node of the Industrial Revolution. While it wasn't a new invention per se, its use on a widespread industrial scale was. For millennia, human industry had depended on surface energy, wood for fuel, wind for sails, water for mills. While these sources were renewable, they were also limited, geographically constrained, and intermittent. Coal was dense, abundant, and energy-rich, allowing furnaces to burn hotter and longer than wood ever could. Britain's vast coal seams made it uniquely positioned to exploit this advantage. Within a few years, it had completely decoupled industry from rivers and forests. Factories no longer needed to sit beside water wheels. They could be built wherever labour, capital, and transport converged. This was humanity's first large-scale use of fossil energy, and it powered not only factories and engines, but also unprecedented urban growth. Steam engines. Category: energy and materials, transportation. Steam engines are where coal learned how to move. Early designs, like Thomas Newcomen's atmospheric engine, were crude but revolutionary. By boiling water and condensing steam, they turned heat into mechanical motion. By the 1760s, James Watt's improvements transformed steam from a specialized pump into a universal power source. By separating the condenser, improving efficiency, and enabling rotary motion, Watt made steam engines adaptable to factories, mills, and transportation. From that moment on, steam engines would function as humanity's first true artificial muscles, only they didn't need any rest. They could operate day and night as long as fuel and water were supplied. Railways. Category: transportation. Railways fused steam power with infrastructure, turning the landscape itself into part of the machine. Iron rails provided low-friction paths for steam locomotives capable of hauling massive loads at unprecedented speeds, and for far less than any canal or road ever could. But railways did more than transport cargo. They also synchronized time, as the introduction of timetables forced towns to agree on standard hours. As markets expanded from local to national, new settlements grew along rail lines. Compared to canals, which followed geography, railways imposed geometry, deftly cutting through hills, bridging valleys, and tunneling through mountains. For the first time, land was no longer a permanent obstacle. In the tech tree, railways are a multiplier node, accelerating every other industrial process by speeding the flow of materials, labour, and information. Iron ships. Category: transportation, energy and materials. Wooden hulls had dominated shipbuilding for centuries, but they were limited by rot, size, and structural weakness. The application of iron changed that, allowing vessels to grow larger, stronger, and more durable. Paired with steam propulsion, iron ships became independent of wind and weather. More importantly, cargo capacity increased dramatically, further increasing the reliability and profitability of trade. Machine tools, category, tools, energy and materials. Machine tools form the quiet backbone of industrial civilization. Though many had been invented centuries earlier, this was the first time they could operate at real power and on a real industrial scale. Lathes, planers, and boring mills allowed metal parts to be shaped with unprecedented precision. John Wilkinson's boring mill, which was capable of producing perfectly cylindrical steam engine cylinders, essentially opened the door to the engines we know today. While easy to overlook in the big scheme of things, machine tools are a major reason industrial technology grew so exponentially. Factory system, category, information and media, tools. The invention of the factory system was world-changing because it reorganized human labor around machines. Instead of artisans controlling the pace of work, machines dictated the rhythm. Steam engines powered centralized production lines that ran continuously, necessitating the division of labor into specialized repetitive tasks. Factories were not just buildings, they were social machines. Throughout the revolution, urban populations exploded as workers migrated to industrial centers. As a result, brand new social classes formed around ownership, management, and wage labor. Factories scaled output beyond imagination, but at the cost of human autonomy and health. In the tech tree, the factory system is best categorized as a social technology, one that restructured society to serve machines as much as machines serve society. Interchangeable parts, category, tools, measurement and standards. The advent of precision manufacturing made real standardization and interchangeability possible. So, instead of crafting unique components that required hand-fitting, parts could now be produced to exact standards and swapped freely. This revolutionized repair, maintenance and assembly by turning machines into modular systems. It also enabled the development of production lines, which boosted reliability while cutting costs. Cotton gin, category, farming, tools. The city was not the only part of life undergoing massive productivity changes. In fact, improvements in agriculture are exactly what sent millions of farm workers, now out of the job, into the factories in the first place. The cotton gin is one of the clearest examples of a small mechanical change producing vast systemic consequences. Invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, it mechanized the task of separating fiber from a seed. What once took hours of tedious hand labor can now be done dozens of times faster with a simple machine. This explosion in efficiency transformed cotton from a marginal crop into the backbone of the global textile industry. But the cotton gin also reveals a darker truth about technological progress. Rather than reducing human suffering, it intensified systems of exploitation. In the American South, for instance, cotton plantations expanded dramatically, driving the entrenchment and expansion of enslaved labor. Power looms, category, tools, housing and clothing. Weaving had defined skilled labor for thousands of years. However, it was mostly limited to highly trained artisans working in small shops or out of the home. The power loom replaced that tradition with automated motion. Driven first by water and later by steam, the addition of power meant looms could operate continuously, producing cloth faster, cheaper, and more uniformly than human hands ever could. Like everything else, textile production became less about artistry and more about speed. Though this made clothing more affordable for entire populations, it permanently displaced a whole group of specialists from the workforce. Canals, category, transportation, energy and materials. While intercontinental railroads were being built, canals formed the circulatory system of industrial logistics, offering a smooth, energy-efficient way to move massive loads inland at a fraction of the cost of road transport. Britain's canal boom, for example, completely reshaped the countryside. Engineers carved waterways through hills, built locks to manage elevation, and erected aqueducts to cross entire valleys. As a result of this need, disciplines like surveying and civil engineering matured more rapidly. In the tech tree, canals represent the transitional infrastructure between pre-industrial transport and the rail age. While slower than trains, they helped establish the same logistical mindset that railways will inherit and accelerate. Suspension bridges. Category: housing and clothing, energy and materials. Suspension bridges signalled a fundamental shift in how engineers thought about structure. Instead of relying on mass and compression, suspension bridges used tension to span gaps that stone arches could never cross. These new bridges swayed, flexed, and adapted to stress rather than fighting it, leading to a new engineering philosophy that eschewed static monuments in favour of responsive systems. Gaslighting. Category: energy and materials, housing and clothing. Gaslighting extended the Industrial Revolution into the night. By piping coal gas through urban networks, cities achieved reliable, centralised illumination for streets, factories and homes. Darkness, which had forever placed a hard limit on human activity, had effectively been conquered. And so, urban culture transformed, workdays lengthened, and the concept of a nightlife emerged. Gasworks introduced industrial chemistry directly into municipal infrastructure, turning cities into energy systems capable of distributing fuel, light, and risk through networks of pipes and valves. Thermodynamics. Category: mathematics, energy and materials. The attempt to perfect steam engines forced humanity to confront the nature of energy. Specifically, it led to questions such as, why do engines waste heat? Why can't efficiency reach 100%? These practical questions gave rise to thermodynamics, also known as the science of energy transformation. Figures like Carnot, Joule, and Kelvin formalised concepts such as work, entropy, and conservation of energy, which they soon realised could be applied to all physical processes, not just engines. In the tech tree, thermodynamics is a governing framework. It doesn't so much enable technology as constrain it, defining the boundaries within which all future energy systems must operate. Statistics. Category: mathematics, information and media. Industrial society was so complex and crowded that it needed a whole new way of measuring itself. As governments, insurers and scientists collected data on births, deaths, disease, trade and production, patterns started to emerge. Eventually someone realised that risks could be calculated and policies could be optimised. As the great systematization continued, it was statistics that turned populations into systems. This was a profound shift in governance because it meant that decisions increasingly relied on aggregated data rather than anecdote or tradition. People became something that could be managed at scale. Chemistry, category, energy and materials, medicine. By the early 19th century, chemistry had completed its transition from speculative art to foundational science. In doing so, it became one of the most powerful accelerators in the industrial tech tree. What separated industrial chemistry from earlier traditions was the application of standardization and measurement. Substances were no longer thought of as transforming mysteriously, but breaking down and recombining according to rules. Now reactions could be replicated anywhere, by anyone, given the same conditions. This turned chemistry into an industrial language. Metallurgy improved through better fluxes and alloy control. Textile industries exploded with synthetic dyes that were brighter, cheaper, and more durable than natural pigments. Explosives became more powerful and predictable. Fertilizers began to alter agricultural yields. Fuels and lubricants improved machine longevity. In the tech tree, chemistry is a horizontal supernode. It does not sit neatly on one branch, but supports virtually everything above it in one way or another. Medicine the thread. Category: medicine. The new chemical and statistical worldview had a significant impact on industrial-era medicine. For most of human history, medicine focused on treating illness after it appeared. But the Industrial Revolution introduced a different logic: prevention, intervention, and infrastructure. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccination, one of the most essential technologies in history, proved that disease could be stopped before it began, and vaccination campaigns showed that health could be organised at a population-wide scale. At the same time, advances in chemistry made surgery more survivable. Ether and chloroform anaesthesia eliminated pain as a limiting factor, allowing longer, more precise procedures. This transformed surgery from rapid, bloody brutality to controlled intervention. Industrial urbanization initially created perfect conditions for disease, overcrowding, contaminated water, and poor sanitation. In response, reformers like Edwin Chadwick and John Snow applied statistics and infrastructure to health, bringing back and improving on technologies that had lain dormant since the Roman era, like sewers and clean water systems. In the end, pipes, pumps, filtration, and urban planning saved more lives than any single drug. By the mid-19th century, humanity had entered a fundamentally new technological state. Energy was no longer gathered, but extracted. Labour was no longer human or animal, but mechanical. Production was no longer artisanal, but systemic. Most importantly, technology had become self-reinforcing, as each branch of the tech tree accelerated the others. Rather than end, the Industrial Revolution simply morphed into something else, and when it did, it would spark ideas that, quite literally, lit up the world. Second, Industrial and Electrification. The Second Industrial Revolution marks the moment when humanity unified three forces that had previously evolved in partial isolation: energy, information, and motion. And the connective tissue that bound them all together. That was electricity. Energy could now move invisibly through wires, meaning that motion and light could be summoned instantly from miles away. This era completed the merger of science and industry, so that discoveries no longer needed to wait generations to be applied. And so, the revolution lived up to its name and just kept on rolling. Generators, dynamos, category, energy and materials. The generator is the gateway technology of electrification. Based on the principles of electromagnetic induction, generators converted mechanical rotation into electric current. Spinning coils through magnetic fields transformed motion into invisible flow, so that energy was no longer bound to shafts, belts, or pistons. Because they could scale, dynamos soon replaced chemical batteries as the primary source of electricity. The principle was simple. As long as something could turn, electricity could be produced continuously. Pretty much every modern power source traces its lineage here, from hydroelectric dams and coal plants to wind turbines and nuclear reactors. Transformers, category, energy and materials, measurement and standards. As impressive as they were, generators alone could not build an electrical world. To do that, technology needed to find a way for electricity to travel. Transformers solved this problem by allowing voltage to be stepped up or down much more efficiently. Where high voltage minimized losses over long distances, low voltage made electricity safe and usable in homes and factories. Thanks to this single innovation, electricity could be turned from a local phenomenon into a network. Single power plants could soon serve entire regions, meaning that cities could grow independent of where energy was produced. AC/DC systems, category, energy and materials. The late 19th century witnessed a defining architectural conflict: direct current versus alternating current, a debate that continues in some circles to this day. Both had their pros and cons. Direct current systems were stable and straightforward, but suffered severe losses over distance. Alternating current, though more complex, could be transformed efficiently and transmitted far from its source. This rivalry was not just technical. It determined how cities would be wired, how power would be generated, and how infrastructure would evolve for the next century. Though AC eventually became the gold standard, DC didn't vanish. In fact, it would later return as an essential function of modern electronics. Electric motors, category, energy and materials, tools. Where generators made electricity possible, electric motors made it practical. Essentially, these motors relied on the logic of electromagnetic induction, transforming electrical current back into controlled motion. Instead of pistons, belts and steam shafts, motion now emerged silently from magnetic fields. This meant power could start instantly, stop instantly, and be precisely regulated throughout. And this flexibility would go on to change virtually everything about industrial design. Factories no longer needed a single central engine driving endless belts. Machines could instead be distributed across the floor according to workflow rather than proximity to power. As a result, production lines became modular and layouts became more logical, increasing overall efficiency. Electric motors also scaled downward, allowing them to power fans, sewing machines, and household appliances. In the tech tree, electric motors represent the democratization of motion, completing the circuit between energy generation and daily life. Advanced communications. Category: Information and Media. The telegraph was the first system to convert information into electrical signals. By converting letters of words into a series of pulses, it completely revolutionized communication, altering the function of financial markets, military commands, and news cycles overnight. For the first time, events in one city could influence decisions in another almost immediately. Just 40 years later, this technology would be rendered irrelevant by the telephone, which was capable of carrying the human voice itself. This meant that businesses could coordinate in real time, and personal relationships could stretch across cities, counties, and eventually nations. Not long after came the radio, which removed the wire entirely. While the messages only went one way, a single transmitter could reach millions of listeners simultaneously. In terms of the tech tree, this progression marks the birth of networked consciousness, where humanity first begins to experience itself as a connected system. Light bulbs. Category: Energy and materials, housing and clothing. The idea was remarkably simple. An incandescent bulb enclosed a glowing filament in a vacuum, producing steady illumination without flame, smoke, or soot. Like the gas lamp before it, the light bulb served to remove nighttime as a limitation on human activity. As it became more widely used, urban life again reorganized itself around this new artificial light. Work schedules lengthened, entertainment flourished, and architecture changed due to the fact that interiors no longer depended on windows alone. Electric grids. Category: Energy and materials. As electrical systems multiplied, they merged. Individual generators and lighting systems connected into regional networks where power plants fed transmission lines, transformers balanced load, and substations stabilized flow. Around the increasingly modern world, electricity became continuous, shared, and resilient. This interconnection introduced a new concept: energy as a service rather than a device. But to make this work, standards were essential. Experts immediately set about establishing standards for frequency, voltage, insulation, and safety to unify electrical practice across cities and nations. Alloys. Category: Energy and materials. During the Second Industrial Revolution, metallurgy entered a new era of intentional design. Instead of working with generic iron or steel, engineers began alloying metals to achieve specific properties. Chromium prevented corrosion, nickel added toughness, vanadium improved fatigue resistance. These alloys enabled turbines to spin continuously, rails to endure decades of stress, surgical instruments to resist contamination, and buildings to reach unprecedented heights. Without them, the infrastructure of this era may not exist. Portland cement. Category: Housing and clothing, energy and materials. Cement had remained virtually unchanged since Roman times, but Portland cement, which was produced through tightly controlled kiln chemistry, created concrete that was stronger, more predictable, and more scalable than any ancient equivalent. Mixed with aggregate and reinforced with steel, it formed a composite capable of bearing enormous loads. This allowed those new suspension bridges to grow even longer, and for those new urban buildings to grow even higher. And unlike Roman concrete, which relied on local materials and artisanal practice, Portland cement followed standardized formulas, meaning it could be produced anywhere industry existed. The camera. Category: Information and media, tools. The camera transformed light into a permanent record. What began as an optical curiosity became, in the industrial age, a reproducible technology for capturing reality. Early cameras relied on basic optics, lenses focusing light onto a surface. However, the decisive breakthrough came with the development of photosensitive chemistry. Light no longer just projected images, but actually changed matter. Silver-based compounds allowed scenes to be imprinted onto plates, and later onto flexible film, fixing moments in time. This had profound effects. cameras altered journalism, science, warfare, and memory itself. For the first time, events could be documented rather than described, allowing evidence to be presented rather than argued. Aluminum smelting. Category: energy and materials. Once rarer than gold, aluminum became common only after the Hall-Héroult process, which used electricity to extract it from ore. This was the first time metallurgy was powered directly by electrical current rather than solely by heat. The result was a metal that was lightweight, conductive, corrosion-resistant, and most importantly abundant, at least where electricity was cheap. Throughout the era, aluminum would go on to completely reshape power transmission, transportation, packaging, and eventually aviation. Bicycles. Category: transportation. Invented somewhere around 1817, the bicycle was a masterpiece of mechanical optimization. Ball bearings reduced friction while chain drives transmitted power efficiently, and pneumatic tyres smoothed motion. Together, they created one of the most energy-efficient machines ever built. Bicycles are such a vital invention because they were the first thing to truly democratize mobility. With it, workers could commute farther and faster than ever before. It even served a role in women's liberation by permitting them to travel without a male chaperone. Internal combustion engines. Category: energy and materials, transportation. Instead of heating water to drive pistons indirectly, combustion engines ignited precise mixtures of fuel and air inside sealed cylinders. Each explosion produced immediate mechanical work, pushing pistons that converted linear force into rotary motion. Early designs by Nicholas Otto established the 4-stroke cycle, transforming combustion from a violent reaction into a repeatable process. Rudolf Diesel further developed the concept, using compression rather than spark ignition to achieve higher efficiency and greater torque. These engines were smaller, lighter, and more responsive than steam engines, while delivering comparable power. This single invention unlocked an entirely new sub-branch of the tech tree: self-contained mobility. Before long, engines would be mounted on carriages to give us one of the most critical developments in all of transportation. Automobiles. Category: transportation. Revolutionary as they were, early motorcars were fragile novelties, assembled by hand and affordable only to elites. What transformed them into a civilizational force was not invention, but production. Assembly lines, most famously refined by Henry Ford, reorganized manufacturing around standardized parts, timed labor, and continuous flow. This turned cars into products rather than projects. And as automobiles spread, landscapes changed to accommodate them. Roads expanded and hardened, bridges multiplied, and fuel stations sprang up in urban and rural areas alike. By 1910, entire industries had emerged around rubber, oil, glass, steel, insurance, advertising, and repair. And since distance no longer dictated residence, cities began to sprawl outward, and daily life started to reorganize around commuting. Subways. Category: transportation, housing, and clothing. Decades before cars crowded the streets, rapid urbanization was already straining surface transport beyond its limits. Bizarrely, engineers agreed that the best solution was to tunnel beneath the city itself. The first working subway was in London, followed by Budapest, Paris, and New York City. These early underground lines began with steam locomotives, but electrification quickly proved essential, eliminating smoke and reducing heat. And since subway systems required unprecedented engineering coordination, they helped forge new advances in tunneling, ventilation systems, and signaling networks. But these were not the only inventions contributing to a new vertical approach to the world. Aviation. Category: transportation. Human flight had been imagined for millennia, but only became possible when multiple branches converged. Without lightweight combustion engines, precision machining, aerodynamic theory, and new materials like aluminum and muslin fabric, the Wright brothers' contraption would likely have crashed into the dunes. They were also building on the work of early aviation pioneers like Otto Lilienthal, who studied lift, drag, and control surfaces for years, despite never achieving more than a glide. The first successful powered flights were brief, but their implications were enormous. Once again, distance collapsed. By the mid-20th century, geography would lose its final monopoly on movement as aviation reshaped everything from warfare to commerce to travel. Electromagnetism, category, mathematics, energy and materials. In the 1860s, James Clerk Maxwell's equations unified electricity, magnetism and light into a single theoretical framework in which energy was not just a substance or force, but a field propagating as waves through space. This meant that motors, generators, radios and transmission lines could now be designed mathematically before being built. Trial and error gave way to calculation. In the tech tree, electromagnetism is a theoretical backbone supporting every electrical and electronic technology to come. Spectroscopy, category, measurement and standards, chemistry. Spectroscopy taught humanity how to read matter using light. By dispersing light into spectra, scientists discovered that each element emitted and absorbed specific wavelengths. This meant that substances could be identified without touching them. It might seem like a novelty when put that way, but spectroscopy drastically changed disciplines like chemistry and astronomy, even allowing scientists to determine the composition of stars across unimaginable distances. Finally, it introduced the idea that atoms had internal structure, a clue that would later open the door to quantum physics. The periodic table, category, chemistry, sure information and media. Invented in 1869 in St. Petersburg, Russia, the periodic table imposed order on the ever-growing chaos of chemical discovery. By arranging elements according to recurring properties, its creator, Dmitry Mendeleev, revealed that matter followed patterns deeper than observation. This meant that missing elements could be predicted before they were found. Moreover, their properties could be inferred before measurement. This was, essentially, chemistry as architecture. The table unified materials science, guided industrial experimentation, and shifted elemental discovery from accident to exploration. Medicine A4, category medicine. Medicine entered its modern phase by embracing causality. Perhaps the most important revelation was germ theory, which identified specific microorganisms as the agents of disease. Innovators like Pasteur and Koch replaced vague miasmas with testable mechanisms, while sterilization and antisepsis transformed surgery from a last resort into a routine procedure. The X-ray, invented in Germany in 1895, allowed doctors to see internal anatomy without incision for the first time. Before long, laboratories became central to medicine. Hospitals evolved into research institutions, treatment became evidence-based, and public health strategies targeted transmission rather than symptoms. This marks the advent of the world treating disease as a solvable system. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the convergence of hundreds of technologies from the past, from microscopes to math, all the way back to the harnessing of fire. Firearms 3, category weapons. By the mid-19th century, firearms stopped being handcrafted tools and became products of industry. What mattered now was not just the weapon itself, but the factories, materials, and energy systems capable of producing it in massive numbers. The first major shift was reliability and speed. Early percussion cap firearms replaced flintlocks, eliminating weather sensitivity and misfires. This improvement made firearms dependable enough to standardize across entire armies. Next came breech-loading mechanisms. Instead of ramming powder and shot from the muzzle, soldiers could load cartridges from the rear of the weapon. This dramatically increased the rate of fire, allowed soldiers to reload while prone, and reduced exposure on the battlefield. Later came metallic cartridges. These combined bullets, propellant and primer into a single sealed unit, making firearms even faster, safer, and more consistent. With cartridges came bolt-action rifles. Fed by internal magazines, they defined infantry combat by the late 19th century. They were not only accurate at long range, but mechanically robust and suitable for industrial armies. Then, in 1861, Richard Jordan Gatling invented a manually cranked weapon capable of firing up to 600 rounds per minute. This sparked a race to see who could create a true machine gun, thus taking fire suppression to a terrifying new extreme. Alongside small arms, artillery underwent its own industrial transformation. Smoothbore cannons gave way to rifled barrels, improving range and accuracy, while breech-loading artillery increased firing speed and crew safety. Soon after that, high-explosive shells replaced solid shot, effectively turning artillery into an area destruction weapon rather than a precision tool. By the eve of World War I, humanity had unified power, motion, and information into a single technological system. Electricity was flowing through major cities, while engines were carrying millions of people who had been stuck across landscapes. Humans were not only engineering matter but also finding new ways to analyze and counter disease. The world was moving faster, in fact, than social institutions could comfortably adapt. In a few short years, that acceleration would find a wealth of new avenues to pursue, some life-saving and some life-ending. Early 20th century. The early 20th century marks one of the most intense compression points in the entire human tech tree. It represents the moment when centuries of scientific progress collided with global conflict, accelerating innovation at a pace never seen before or since. Technology in this era existed in constant duality. The same machines that extended life expectancy, expanded knowledge, and increased productivity also enabled destruction on an industrial scale. It was the point where science, industry, and warfare became inseparable. The two world wars forced nations to mobilize entire technological ecosystems as well as armies. Around the globe, laboratories, factories, universities, and logistics networks were reorganized around a single goal: speed. Whoever could compute faster, produce more reliably, and adapt more quickly would survive. Analog computers, category, mathematics, information and media. As engineering problems grew more complex, human calculation became a bottleneck. Artillery trajectories, aircraft stability, electrical networks, and fluid dynamics all required solving differential equations too complex for hand calculation at wartime speeds. The solution was not faster humans, but machines that physically embodied mathematics. Analog computers solved problems by imitation rather than abstraction. Gears rotated to represent variables, while various voltages stood in for quantities. Motion itself became computation. Instead of calculating equations, engineers built machines that behaved like the equations described. These devices produced results in real time. Change one parameter, and the system responded immediately. For targeting, navigation, and engineering design, this capability was revolutionary. From the perspective of the tech tree, analog computation represented a profound conceptual leap, in which thought was no longer confined to brains or symbols, but could be built into matter. Differential analyzers, category, mathematics, information and media. The most advanced expression of analog computing took shape in the differential analyzer. Developed in the 1930s by engineers such as Vannevar Bush, these massive machines used interconnected rotating shafts, disks and gear trains to perform automatic integration. The result? Problems that once required teams of human calculators working for weeks could now be solved in hours. While not programmable in the modern sense, analyzers were configurable. More importantly, they proved that computation itself could be engineered. This means that humanity had already learned that reasoning could be mechanized long before electronics ever entered the picture. Punch cards, tabulation. Category, information and media, mathematics. While analog machines simulated physics, a parallel revolution in information processing unfolded. Punch cards, initially developed for controlling textile looms, evolved into the backbone of early data systems. Each hole represented a decision, such as yes, no, or present, absent. It might not seem revolutionary in retrospect, but tabulators completely transformed governments and industries. They allowed census data, payrolls, inventories, logistics schedules, and production quotas to be processed at a national scale. What's more, wartime economies depended on these systems to manage millions of workers and tons of material. Punch card systems turned administration into machinery, creating a new branch for the tech tree: structured data. Weapons fee, category, weapons energy and materials, transportation. Nowhere did technological convergence accelerate faster or more violently than in warfare. Tanks fused metallurgy, engines, suspension systems, and firearm design into mobile fortresses that reshaped land warfare. Aircraft extended combat into the sky, combining aerodynamics, engines, navigation, and weapons into a three-dimensional attack and defense strategy. Submarines turned the ocean into a battlefield of invisibility, while radar and sonar extended human senses beyond sight alone. Cryptography, which dates back to 2000 BCE, received a much-needed upgrade as devices like the Enigma machine encrypted communication at scale. Meanwhile, enemies rushed to develop equally complex machines and mathematical insight to break the codes. The next major destructive development was rocketry, but the V2 was not just a weapon. Rather, it was a proof of concept for guided high-speed flight beyond the atmosphere. While it was designed with the worst of intentions, it remains the most pivotal node in what would eventually become spaceflight. Firearms 4. Category Weapons. The First World War revealed the full consequences of industrial firearms. Machine guns, once experimental, became the backbone of defensive combat. Positioned in overlapping fields of fire, they rendered frontal assaults suicidal. As a result, infantry tactics froze and trenches spread across entire continents. To break the stalemate, firearms diversified. Infantry rifles were refined for durability and power, while light machine guns emerged to bring automatic fire down to the squad level. These portable weapons allowed infantry units to maneuver while maintaining suppressive fire, laying the groundwork for modern combined arms tactics. Meanwhile, artillery became the primary killer in modern warfare. Indirect fire techniques allowed guns to strike unseen targets. In many cases, entire offensives were preceded by days or weeks of bombardment. In other cases, new doctrines like creeping barrages synchronized artillery fire with advancing infantry, turning guns into moving walls of destruction. As tanks entered the battlefield, firearms adapted again. Early responses included anti-tank rifles, which fired high-velocity rounds capable of penetrating thin armor. These were soon replaced by dedicated anti-tank guns, purpose-built artillery designed to destroy armored vehicles at range. Firearms also moved into the air and sea. Aircraft-mounted machine guns and autocannons transformed dogfighting and ground attack, while naval guns reached unprecedented scales, guided by mechanical fire control systems and later radar. Synthetic fertilizers. Category: farming, energy and materials. One of the most paradoxical technologies was synthetic fertilizers, which, like so many other innovations, also fed both life and death. This came as the Haber-Bosch process, enabled chemists to fix nitrogen from the air, producing ammonia on an industrial scale. This single reaction shattered the natural limits of agriculture. Crop yields exploded, allowing billions to be fed more reliably. But the same chemistry enabled the production of newer, larger, and more powerful explosives. Of course, throughout the early 20th century there would be no shortage of demand for both food and bombs. Plastics. Category: energy and materials. The invention of plastics marked a fundamental shift in how humans related to materials. It was, put simply, the first substance to be truly designed from scratch. Unlike rubber, shellac, or cellulose-based materials, plastics did not rely on biological precursors. It could also be engineered to be rigid, heat-resistant, and electrically insulating. This property made plastics ideal for the rapidly emerging electrified world. Switches, sockets, telephones, radio housings, and industrial components all demanded materials that would not melt, conduct electricity, or degrade under heat. Plastic delivered all three. Synthetic rubber. Category: energy and materials. Rubber had long been essential for tyres, seals, hoses, and shock absorption. But natural rubber depended on tropical plantations, a fragile supply chain in the best of times, let alone in the midst of global war. When access to natural rubber was threatened, chemists turned to polymer science. By manipulating petroleum-derived molecules, they created synthetic rubbers such as Buna and neoprene, which could be engineered for elasticity, oil resistance, temperature tolerance, and durability. This was a crucial evolution in materials thinking. Instead of accepting rubber's natural variability, engineers could now specify performance in advance. As such, tyres behaved more consistently, seals lasted longer, and machinery became more reliable under extreme conditions. Nylon. Category: energy and materials, housing and clothing. Where plastics replaced wood and rubber replaced latex, nylon replaced silk, and with it, an entire biological supply chain. Developed by DuPont in the 1930s, nylon was the first synthetic fibre produced entirely through petroleum-based chemistry. And it was not merely an imitation of silk, it actually surpassed it in tensile strength, elasticity, and resistance to moisture and decay. During World War II, it replaced silk in parachutes, ropes, nets, and cords. After the war, it flowed into civilian life in the form of clothing, carpets, fishing lines, and toothbrushes. Like many technologies of this era, nylon marked a deeper philosophical shift in which nature's solutions were no longer seen as endpoints, but as templates to be exceeded through science. Medicine V, category, medicine. The early 20th century transformed medicine more radically than any era before it, turning healing from a localized craft into a global technological system. Insulin therapy, developed in the early 1920s, exemplified this transformation. Diabetes, which had once been a certain death sentence, instantly transformed into a manageable condition through hormone extraction, purification, and standardized dosing. Antibiotics completed the revolution. Penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming and industrialized during World War II, introduced a new class of medicine, drugs that selectively attacked pathogens without destroying the host. This meant that infection, humanity's oldest enemy, could finally be controlled. But this required more than mere discovery. It required manufacturing of fermentation tanks, purification pipelines, dosage standards, and quality control systems. Healing, like so many other aspects of life, had to be industrialized to keep up with an industrialized world. All the while, pressure from the wars accelerated the development of supporting systems. Blood typing and banking allowed transfusions to be stored and transported, while new anesthesia made complex surgeries much more survivable. As the wars ended, civilians around the world benefited from all of the advancements that had been rushed to the front lines. By 1945, humanity stood at the edge of a new technological phase. The wars had been catastrophic, but they had also forced technologies to mature, integrate, and scale. And so, the next era would not be defined by raw power, but by logic, code, and the atom itself. Atomic and Space Age. The Atomic and Space Age marked a profound shift in humanity's technological identity. For the first time, we began manipulating the fundamental forces of the universe itself, including nuclear energy, electromagnetic fields, subatomic particles, and orbital motion. The wars had fused science, industry, and state power into a single system, and the technologies that followed inherited that scale. Energy became abstract, invisible, and overwhelmingly powerful. Information moved at the speed of light. Machines grew smaller even as systems grew planetary. Most important of all, for the very first time, humanity bit off more than it could chew and introduced a technology capable of destroying our own world. Atomic weapons, category, weapons, energy and materials. The concept for an atomic bomb had been discussed for decades, but it wasn't until 1945 that it finally became a brutal, terrifying reality. Known simply as the bomb at the time, it demonstrated that humanity could unleash energies previously found only in the stars. Suddenly, a single device could erase a city in seconds, turning warfare from a tactical endeavour to an existential one. The development of thermonuclear weapons, which used fusion to multiply destructive power, pushed this further still. And so, strategies shifted from winning wars to preventing them. Could peace be maintained by the threat of annihilation? It was a big question, and one that we still don't know the answer to. Isotope separation. Category: energy and materials, measurement as standards. Atomic technology required unprecedented material precision. Separating uranium isotopes demanded techniques capable of sorting atoms by mass, an engineering challenge beyond traditional chemistry. Industrial-scale methods such as gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, and later centrifuges were developed, consuming enormous resources to achieve microscopic discrimination. Before long, entire facilities existed solely to refine matter at the atomic level. These techniques later enabled peaceful applications, including the production of medical isotopes and scientific research. However, they also represented a philosophical shift in which materials were no longer refined by bulk properties alone, but by nuclear identity. On the tech tree, this is the first real appearance of what we call nanotechnological thinking. Nuclear fission reactors, category, energy and materials. The same discoveries that made atomic weapons possible also revealed a new source of energy unlike anything seen before. Nuclear fission reactors harnessed the splitting of heavy atomic nuclei to release vast amounts of heat. Unlike chemical fuels, which rearrange electrons, fission converts tiny amounts of mass directly into energy, and the density was staggering. With fission reactors, a small quantity of fuel could power a city. This transformed the bomb's violent physics into a steady industrial process. Heat from fission boiled water, drove turbines, and generated electricity through familiar mechanical means. Only the source of that heat was fundamentally new. Nuclear power promised near-limitless energy, decoupled from geography and fuel transport. It also introduced new risks in the form of radiation, waste, and catastrophic failure. Radiation detection, category, measurement and standards, medicine. Radiation is invisible, persistent, and lethal. So if the atomic age was going to be navigable, the world needed detection technology. Fortunately, Geiger counters, scintillation detectors, and dosimeters transformed radiation from an unknowable threat into measurable data. This meant that exposure could be tracked, environments could be monitored, and safety protocols could be enforced. These instruments extended human perception beyond biology, allowing interaction with forces the body could not sense, at least not until it was too late. Nuclear medicine. Category: medicine. People often joke that everything was atomic in the atomic age, but this is more accurate than many realize. Take nuclear medicine, for instance. Though we hardly think of it in those terms today, it was the use of radioactive isotopes as tracers that allowed physicians to track metabolic activity inside living bodies in real time. It also gave us technologies such as PET scans, which could visualize organ function rather than just structure, and radiotherapy, which used focused radiation to destroy cancer cells. Liquid fuel rocketry. Category: transportation, energy and materials. As humanity looked toward the stars, they knew they would need new technologies to get there. Liquid fuel rocketry solved the problem of sustained propulsion beyond the atmosphere. By combining liquid oxygen with fuels such as hydrogen or kerosene, engineers achieved controlled throttleable thrust. Unlike solid rockets, liquid engines allowed for fine adjustment, long burn times, and staged designs. This made orbital flight possible while bridging military development and scientific exploration. They were still missiles, but now destruction was optional. Orbital mechanics. Category: mathematics, transportation. Orbital mechanics transformed space from an unreachable void into a structured, predictable environment, all thanks to math. Building on Newtonian physics, engineers discovered that reaching orbit was not about climbing upward, but accelerating sideways fast enough to continuously miss the Earth as it curved away beneath them. This insight reframed spaceflight entirely. Suddenly, it was velocity, not altitude, that was the critical variable. And so, engineers set about calculating precise balances between gravity, momentum, and trajectory, turning equations into flight plans. Elliptical orbits, transfer windows, and escape velocities became practical engineering concerns rather than abstract theory. Once mastered, orbital mechanics unlocked an entirely new domain of transportation. Satellites could remain aloft indefinitely. Space stations, though only a dream until 1971, could, in theory, be resupplied. In the tech tree, orbital mechanics represents the moment humanity learned not just to reach space, but to stay there deliberately. ICBMs. Category: weapons, transportation. Likely the darkest practical application of orbital and rocket science was the development of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Unlike bombers or ships, these weapons followed ballistic trajectories that briefly entered near space before re-entering the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. With their fully autonomous guidance systems, ICBMs were nearly impossible to intercept with early defences. During the Cold War, this new threat forced unprecedented integration between computation, sensing, communication, and command authority. Launch decisions became matters of systems engineering as much as politics. Satellites, category, transportation, information and media. Artificial satellites redefined what it meant to observe, communicate and coordinate on a global scale. Beginning with Sputnik in 1957, orbiting machines became permanent extensions of Earth-based infrastructure. Communication satellites relayed radio and television signals across continents, while weather satellites tracked storms and climate patterns in real time, effectively turning the atmosphere into a measurable system. Meanwhile, scientific satellites mapped radiation belts, solar activity, and cosmic background signals. As one might expect from a Cold War-era development, satellites also transformed geopolitics. Reconnaissance platforms made troop movements, missile silos, and naval fleets visible from orbit. Suddenly, secrecy was harder to maintain. Crewed missions, category, transportation, energy and materials. Human spaceflight pushed technology beyond redundancy into absolute reliability. Now the machines we shot into space had to do more than function, they also had to support life. New systems were developed to regulate oxygen, carbon dioxide, temperature, humidity, and waste in sealed environments. Navigation systems were improved so that they could work flawlessly far from Earth. Computers, though still primitive by modern standards, were integrated into guidance and control, allowing human pilots to become supervisors of automated systems rather than direct operators. The Apollo missions represented the peak of systems engineering, proving that millions of parts could function together without failure. Eventually, on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 put humanity on another celestial body for the very first time. Re-entry heat shields. Category: energy and materials, transportation. Believe it or not, returning from space actually proved more dangerous than leaving it. Indeed, at orbital speeds, atmospheric friction generated temperatures capable of melting steel in seconds. Heat shield technology solved this through controlled sacrifice. Ablative materials were engineered to burn, melt and vaporize in predictable ways, carrying heat away from the spacecraft, whose shape was designed to maximize deflection. After millennia of technologies focused on energy generation, this was humanity's mastery of energy dissipation at work. Inertial navigation systems. Category: measurement and standards. Transportation. Inertial navigation systems allowed vehicles to know where they were without seeing the world at all. By integrating acceleration and rotation over time, an INS could autonomously calculate position, velocity, and orientation. Originally developed for submarines and missiles, inertial navigation enabled operation beneath oceans, through clouds, and in space, all environments where external references were unreliable or non-existent. The concept of the technology was as clear as it was innovative. Motion itself can be measured, remembered, and predicted. This principle would later be adopted in modern aircraft, spacecraft, and eventually consumer electronics. Transistor. Category: electricity and electronics, information and media. The invention of the transistor in 1947 marked the beginning of true electronic civilization. By controlling electron flow within solid materials, engineers were finally able to replace fragile, power-hungry vacuum tubes with compact, durable switches. Transistors enabled faster circuits, lower power consumption, and unprecedented reliability, so systems that once filled rooms could now fit inside cabinets, then desktops, and eventually pockets. While virtually unknown in popular culture, this single device unlocked modern computing, telecommunications, and automation. Integrated circuits. Category: electricity and electronics, information and media. Integrated circuits condensed entire electronic systems onto a single silicon chip. So, instead of assembling components individually, engineers could etch patterns directly into the material. This both eliminated many sources of failure and dramatically increased speed. As signals now only needed to travel micrometers instead of meters, heat decreased exponentially while the cost per operation plummeted. ICs enabled exponential growth in computing power, so that complexity became a manufacturing problem rather than a design barrier. Semiconductor fabrication, category, electricity and electronics, energy and materials. Semiconductor fabrication marked the moment when control over matter crossed from the mechanical into the atomic. Electronics no longer depended primarily on shaping metal parts or wiring discrete components together. Instead, functionality emerged from the arrangement of atoms in a crystal. At the foundation was ultra-pure silicon. Ordinary silicon was useless for computation, as even trace impurities could ruin electrical behavior. And so, entire industrial pipelines emerged just to refine silicon to parts per billion purity. This was then grown into flawless single crystals, which were sliced into mirror-smooth wafers. The wafer itself became the canvas on which logic would be painted. The key breakthrough was photolithography. This enabled manufacturers to transfer circuit designs onto silicon with microscopic precision. Doping, meanwhile, gave silicon its intelligence. By introducing carefully controlled amounts of elements such as boron or phosphorus, engineers transformed an inert crystal into regions that conduct, resist, or switch electrical current. These doped regions formed the basis of transistors and everything that came after. Printed circuit boards, category, electricity and electronics, tools. Printed circuit boards standardized the physical foundation of electronic systems. Instead of fragile point-to-point wiring assembled by hand, circuits were laid out as intentional pathways, etched directly into copper bonded to insulating boards. Electrical connections became predictable, repeatable, and far easier to inspect or replicate. Early boards were simple, single-layer designs, but even these dramatically reduced wiring errors and improved resistance to vibration, heat, and mechanical stress. As electronic complexity grew, multi-layer printed circuit boards emerged. By stacking conductive layers separated by insulation, designers could route thousands of connections through a compact volume, making dense systems practical rather than fragile. With PCBs, electronics stopped being wired objects and became architected systems upon which complexity could safely accumulate. Radar to microwave tech. Category: electricity and electronics, measurement and standards. Radar research opened the microwave spectrum, which in turn revealed a host of new possibilities for sensing and communication. This is because these high-frequency waves enabled the precise detection of distance, speed, and shape. Before long, microwaves were being employed to support navigation, air traffic control, and weather monitoring. Later, they would do the same for high-bandwidth communication. While it was still invisible, this new technology helped turn the electromagnetic spectrum into engineered territory, further expanding human perception beyond the senses alone. Television. Category: information and media. For the non-scientific minds of the atomic and space age, no invention would have been more impressive than television. For the first time, technology could transmit moving images and synchronize sound directly into private homes, collapsing the distance between events and experience. This innovative new tech required the fusing of multiple branches of the tech tree into a single system. It relied on electronic imaging, signal modulation, transmission infrastructure, vacuum tubes, and later transistors and standardized broadcast frequencies. Cameras converted light into electrical signals while transmitters encoded those signals into radio waves. Receivers reconstructed them into coherent images in real time. Early television systems were mechanically scanned, but fully electronic television quickly took over, enabling higher resolution, greater stability, and improved scalability. After World War II, mass production and electrification turned television from an experimental novelty into a dominant medium almost overnight. Undersea cables. Category: information and media, transportation. Though they were first invented in the late 1860s, undersea cables didn't really come into their own until the 1950s. By laying insulated conductors across the seafloor, islands and even entire continents could be physically linked by continuous electrical pathways. With undersea cables, global communication became permanent rather than episodic. The world's major centres were electrically contiguous, connected by infrastructure that was always on, always transmitting and largely unseen. Information no longer travelled with ships, it travelled beneath them. By the end of the atomic and space age, humanity had crossed thresholds no previous civilization had even approached. Energy could be drawn from atoms to heal as well as destroy. Signals could encircle the planet instantly. Machines could navigate space without sight, think without awareness, and operate beyond human reach. Technology had become invisible, abstract, and overwhelmingly powerful. And as the world entered the information age, materials took a back seat to the sheer overwhelming power of data. Information age. The information age marked the moment electricity crossed a threshold and became intelligence. Circuits no longer merely powered machines, but processed symbols, stored memory, and executed logic. And so, silicon replaced steel as civilization's core material, and information replaced fuel as the primary resource. Unlike earlier eras, progress was no longer measured mainly in horsepower, tonnage, or raw energy, but in how efficiently information could be processed, transmitted, and transformed. Microprocessors, category, electricity and electronics, information and media. Invented in 1971 as the culmination of years of advancements, the microprocessor condensed the logic of an entire computer into a single integrated circuit. When Intel released the 4004 that year, it marked a decisive turning point in which computation no longer required rooms of hardware or racks of components. A microprocessor unified arithmetic, control flow, and memory coordination into a programmable core. This meant that its behavior was not fixed in hardware, but defined by software. As a result, the same chip could become a calculator, a controller, or a communications device simply by changing instructions. Miniaturization slashed cost, power consumption, and physical size. Suddenly, processing power became cheap enough to embed everywhere. In the tech tree, the microprocessor is the seed node of modern intelligence, representing the moment logic became mass-produced. Personal computers, category, information and media, tools. Personal computers brought interactive computation into everyday life. Machines like the Apple II, IBM PC, and Commodore 64 turned users from passive operators into creators. Operating systems standardized how humans interacted with machines, while files, folders, graphical interfaces, and command lines transformed raw computation into usable environments. As a result, software ecosystems emerged, supporting writing, accounting, design, programming, and play. Unlike mainframes, PCs were autonomous. They belonged to individuals. More importantly, they could be customized, modified, and explored. As with every other form of tech democratization throughout history, this one served to completely reshape education, business, and creativity. Networking, TCP, IP, category, information and media, measurement and standards. As computers multiplied, the new challenge became connecting them. The invention of TCP, IP, provided a universal language for machines. Rather than dictating hardware or architecture, it defined how data should be broken into packets, addressed, transmitted, verified, and reassembled. This abstraction allowed any network to join any other. While gamers will appreciate this for opening new digital worlds, it's impossible to discount the myriad ways military systems, academic networks, and commercial infrastructure benefited from this new lack of central control. The Internet, category, information and media, AI. If one were to list the top 5 technologies that changed the world, the Internet would no doubt be near the top of the list. What began as a research network eventually transformed networking into a global nervous system, evolving into a continuously expanding web of information, services, and identities. Websites, email, forums, and later social platforms rewired communication patterns, while search engines turned overwhelming data into navigable knowledge. The Internet was not a library or a broadcaster, but an ecosystem in which all sorts of different types of information responded, updated, and interacted. For the first time, humanity was able to operate within a shared cognitive space. Though there have been plenty of criticisms regarding the results, techno-futurists see the Internet as a valuable step towards a global shared cognition. Graphics, Category: Tools, Information and Media. Graphics processing units accelerated computation by exploiting parallelism. Originally designed for image rendering, GPUs performed thousands of operations simultaneously, enabling real-time 3D graphics. Turning creativity into computation is what allowed animation, video games, simulation, and digital art to completely reshape entertainment and visualization. But entertainment was only one use. GPUs also enabled major advancements in computer-aided design and manufacturing by integrating imagination directly into fabrication. Engineers could design, simulate, and iterate digitally before producing physical objects. Later, GPUs would evolve beyond graphics, becoming literal engines for scientific modeling and artificial intelligence. Programming paradigms. Category: Information and Media, Mathematics. As software grew more complex, programming was forced to mature into structured philosophies rather than ad hoc instruction. Procedural programming emphasized sequence and control, while object-oriented programming modeled systems as interacting entities. In parallel, functional programming treated computation as a mathematical transformation, prioritizing immutability and clarity. Supporting tools reshaped how code was created, while version control enabled large-scale collaboration. Finally, encryption and security practices were created to protect software in transit and during deployment. By the end of this era, code had stopped functioning as instruction alone. It had evolved into architecture. Fiber optics. Category: Transportation, Information and Media. Fiber optics is a technology for transmitting data as light through extremely thin strands of glass or plastic. By replacing electrons with photons, data was suddenly able to travel very fast, very far, and with minimal loss. As a result of this invention, bandwidth exploded and interference virtually vanished. For the first time since the invention of the telegraph, distance almost ceased to matter. Before long, a network of undersea and terrestrial fiber optic cables had formed the physical backbone of the global internet. Cellular phones and networks. Category: Transportation, Information and Media. Cellular networks redefined communication by breaking geography into a mosaic of overlapping zones, or cells, each served by a local radio tower. As users moved, their connections were handed off seamlessly from one cell to the next, allowing for seamless communication from anywhere to anywhere. Early cellular systems were analog, optimized for voice transmission, and limited in capacity. The transition to second-generation digital standards known as 2G dramatically increased call quality, security, and network efficiency, while enabling entirely new behaviors such as text messaging. Third-generation networks, or 3G, extended this logic further. Phones became terminals for email, web browsing, and early multimedia. Though bandwidth was still limited by the time this era ended, the conceptual shift was nonetheless complete. The mobile phone was no longer just a voice device, but a networked computer. Wi-Fi. Category: Information and Media, Transportation. While cellular networks conquered mobility, Wi-Fi transformed local space. Using short-range radio waves, Wi-Fi delivered high-speed internet access without physical cables, turning homes, offices, cafes, and campuses into connected environments. Standardized under the IE 802.11 protocols, Wi-Fi prioritized ease of access and flexibility. This meant that devices could join networks without specialized infrastructure or professional installation. Over time, improvements in speed, reliability, and security erased the trade-off between convenience and performance. The internet stopped being something you plugged into and became something you simply entered. In the tech tree, Wi-Fi represents the atmospheric phase of connectivity, where access stops being an event and moves toward ubiquity. GPS. Category: Measurement and Standards, Transportation. By measuring the precise timing differences between signals from multiple orbiting satellites, global positioning system receivers could calculate position anywhere on Earth, often to within a few meters. Originally developed for military navigation, GPS technology rapidly spilled into civilian use. Throughout the 90s, cars, aircraft, ships, and eventually handheld devices gained real-time spatial awareness. When it was later integrated into consumer electronics, GPS fundamentally altered how humans related to geography. Maps became digital and explorable, while directions became automated. Meanwhile, location-aware services emerged, tying digital information directly to a physical place. Digital cameras, category, information and media, tools. Digital cameras replaced chemical film with semiconductor image sensors. When light struck silicon pixels, it was converted directly into electrical signals, which were then encoded as digital data. Though traditional cameras didn't disappear by any means, the digital transformation collapsed the entire photographic workflow. There was no more development, no waiting, and no physical medium required. Images could be reviewed instantly, edited endlessly, and, thanks to the internet, shared globally at negligible cost. As cameras merged with computers and later smartphones, photography ceased to be a specialized activity. Rather, it became continuous documentation. MP3s. Category: Information and Media, Energy and Materials. The MP3 format, short for MPEG-1 Audio Layer 3, was a digital audio compression format that reduces file size dramatically while keeping sound quality acceptable to the human ear. Removing unnecessary data from music, MP3s enabled simple devices to hold hundreds, and eventually thousands of songs. For the first time, music became detached from physical carriers like tapes and discs. Songs became files, infinitely copyable and transmissible. This change destabilized existing industries while empowering listeners. By the turn of the millennium, playlists had replaced albums, portability had replaced ownership, and musicians were facing a significant reckoning. DVDs. Category: Information and Media, Tools. Digital versatile discs, often abbreviated simply as DVDs, entered the market in the mid-1990s. First invented by Japanese giants Toshiba and Sony, DVDs extended optical storage into high-capacity media, capable of holding feature-length films, software, and complex interactive content. Compared to videotape, DVDs offered superior image quality, durability, and portability. They also eliminated fast-forwarding and rewinding, enabling random access, allowing viewers to jump instantly between scenes, menus, and bonus material. For a brief but critical period, DVDs standardized global media distribution. Though they certainly had their place in the sun, they are today seen as the last bridge between physical media and streaming. Smartphones. Category: Information and Media, AI, Tools. Cell phones had sent shockwaves through the world of communication, but they were soon overshadowed by an even more high-tech invention, the smartphone. These highly advanced devices fused multiple technological branches into a single handheld unit, including microprocessors, touchscreens, cameras, GPS, cellular data, and software ecosystems. Touch-based interfaces replaced symbolic commands with direct manipulation, while apps became modular tools for communication, navigation, entertainment, commerce, and creativity. With constant connectivity and location awareness, smartphones personalized the internet. Suddenly, every individual user could carry a private portal to global information. Weapons V. Category: Weapons, Energy and Materials, Information and Media. Warfare in the information age underwent a fundamental transformation. Like business and entertainment, destruction evolved into a more precise, data-driven practice. Precision-guided munitions mark the clearest shift. By combining GPS, laser designators, and onboard computers, bombs and missiles could strike targets within meters of their aim point. This altered military doctrine entirely. Instead of saturating areas with explosives, forces could disable specific infrastructure with minimal collateral damage. Stealth technology represented a parallel evolution. Aircraft were no longer designed primarily to survive damage, but to avoid detection altogether. Thanks to radar-absorbing materials, internal weapon bays, and sharply angled surfaces, these aircraft scattered incoming signals, turning geometry into a defense. Unmanned aerial vehicles extended this logic further by separating risk from presence. Drones combined real-time video, satellite communication, and precision weapons into platforms that could loiter for hours, while operators located thousands of kilometers away made targeting decisions through screens and data feeds. As more infrastructure became digital, states had to find ways of disabling it digitally. This led to the development of electronic warfare and cyber operations that could target communication networks, power grids, financial systems, and databases. Because of this, disruption could be achieved without explosions through interference, deception, or code. Medicine 6, Category, Medicine, Information and Media, Energy and Materials. The digital world, with its endless sources of information, had a shocking and positive effect on the world of medicine. CT scans assembled X-ray data into detailed cross-sectional maps of the body, allowing physicians to detect tumours, fractures, and internal bleeding with unprecedented clarity. MRI went further, using magnetic fields and radio waves to image soft tissue without radiation, revealing the brain, muscles, and organs in exquisite detail. Thanks to these two inventions alone, each patient's body became a navigable volume of information. At the molecular scale, genetic engineering rewrote biology's rulebook. Recombinant DNA techniques allowed genes to be isolated, copied, modified, and reinserted. It also meant that insulin, growth hormones, and clotting factors could now be manufactured by bacteria. By the 2000s, many diseases were relegated to the realm of fault code, rather than imbalance or fate. Vaccinology advanced alongside molecular biology. Recombinant vaccines reduced risk and increased precision, while antiviral therapies targeted specific stages of viral replication, allowing medicine to intervene directly in the life cycles of pathogens. Surgery, which had long been the most dreaded of medical procedures, also became less invasive and more precise. This was largely due to the use of endoscopes, fiber optic systems, and miniature cameras, which enabled surgeons to operate through tiny incisions rather than larger ones. Once thought to be impossible, organ transplantation crossed a viability threshold through the development of improved immunosuppressants and tissue matching. This brought humanity ever closer to a world where kidneys, livers, hearts, and lungs can be replaced with minimal disruption. Finally, digital medical records unified diagnostics, imaging, lab results, and treatment histories, while population-scale datasets enabled epidemiology, outcome tracking, and early forms of personalized medicine. In the tech tree, this branch marks the moment medicine fused biology, computation, and engineering, turning the body into something that could not only be understood and repaired, but optimized and sustained, potentially indefinitely. By the end of the information age, humanity had done something unprecedented, converting electricity into logic, logic into software, and software into a global nervous system. By the turn of the millennium, virtually every major system had become digital. Communication, finance, navigation, medicine, warfare, entertainment, and even memory itself were translated into bits and bytes. At the same time, technology became personal. Devices shrank, interfaces softened, and computation slipped into pockets and homes. Humans entered the year 2000 living inside of virtually invisible software ecosystems, where convenience masked complexity. And yet, the most important shift was still incomplete. Machines could calculate, store, transmit, and display information, but they did not yet understand it. However, as data accumulated, processors accelerated, and networks thickened, the conditions for a new branch were forming. 21st century to present. At just over a quarter of the way into the 21st century, it's impossible to say for certain what technologies will come to define this budding era. That said, one can make an educated guess. Today, we live in a world where everything is connected, measured, optimized, and updated by data, and intelligence itself is no longer exclusively human. Machine learning and AI, category, AI, information and media, mathematics. For most of computing history, machines followed explicit rules, if this then that. Machine learning changed the relationship between humans and computers by flipping the paradigm. Instead of telling machines what to do, humans gave them examples. From those examples, machines learned patterns. Deep learning pushed this further. By stacking layers of artificial neurons, systems began discovering their own internal representations. These were features that no human had explicitly designed, and they serve to give meaning to a world that computers could not technically see. As data volumes exploded and specialized hardware enabled unprecedented scale in training, foundation models emerged. These single systems are now capable of language, vision, sound, and reasoning across domains. With AI, intelligence has infrastructure, and we still don't even know if we have touched the limits of what that means for us. Data infrastructure, category, information and media, energy and materials. Learning systems demand fuel, and that fuel is data. The 21st century responded with entirely new information architectures, data lakes instead of databases, distributed file systems instead of single servers, stream processing instead of batch reports. Technologies like large-scale distributed computation turned petabytes into something not merely stored, but used, enabling real-time analytics, global synchronization, and millisecond latency across continents. Data centers have now become the factories of the digital age, vast cooled warehouses where raw information is refined into predictions, decisions, and control signals. Industrial robotics, category, tools, energy and materials, AI. With intelligence embedded everywhere, machines no longer have to be rigid. By the turn of the century, industrial robots had become a reality. Sensors have given them sight, force feedback has given them touch, and AI has given them adaptability. Instead of pre-programmed motion, robots are now learning from demonstration. Instead of fixed assembly lines, factories are evolving into reconfigurable systems that operate as self-contained, fabricated organisms capable of perceiving, learning, and working together. Drone and autonomy stacks. Category, transportation, AI, tools. Miniaturized sensors, lightweight composites, and satellite navigation collapse the cost of flight. Today's advanced drones combine perception, planning, and control into autonomy stacks, self-contained decision systems capable of navigating complex environments. They can learn to fly in formation, map terrain, and adapt to changes mid-mission. Now, the same stacks powering drones are learning to drive car, ships, and robots. For 4G, 5G networks and satellite broadband. Category, information and media, transportation. Without connection, most of today's most important technologies would simply cease to exist. Without high-speed networks, cloud computing, mobile platforms, digital services, and coordinated systems simply collapse. In the 1990s, cellular networks expanded beyond voice, beginning the shift toward mobile data. By the 2000s, 4G networks transformed phones into general-purpose computing devices, capable of streaming media, navigation, and continuous online presence. 5G networks changed the priority. Speed still mattered, but low latency became essential. Networks were optimized for instant response, enabling real-time coordination between machines, vehicles, sensors, and users. And so, communication moved from human-centered consumption towards system-to-system interaction. At the same time, satellite broadband constellations filled the remaining gaps. By placing thousands of orbiting relays around the planet, connectivity was suddenly able to reach oceans, deserts, and polar regions, places where physical cables could not economically go. Together, terrestrial networks and orbital infrastructure have turned modern connectivity into a global utility. Internet of Things, IoT. Category, information and media, energy and materials. The Internet of Things did not emerge as a single invention, but as the inevitable convergence of technologies that had been quietly maturing for decades. Microcontrollers had already become cheap enough to embed everywhere, while MEMS sensors had learned to measure motion, pressure, temperature, light, and chemistry at microscopic scales. When these strands were finally woven together, objects gained the ability to sense their environment, communicate their state, and respond to feedback. Today, machines that once operated in isolation have become part of a shared information space. Elliptic curve cryptography and blockchains. Category, mathematics, information and media. As networks became universal and digital systems absorbed finance, identity and infrastructure, trust itself became a technical problem. Earlier security models relied on institutions and centralized control, but global connectivity demanded mechanisms that could operate across borders, devices, and adversaries. Elliptic curve cryptography delivered strong encryption with minimal computational overhead, making secure communication practical for mobile devices, embedded systems, and the expanding Internet of Things. But it took blockchains to extend cryptography from secrecy into coordination. This new technology uses distributed consensus to maintain shared records without a central authority, and the fringe benefit of being able to turn bytes into billions of real dollars has forever changed the way the world sees money. Additive manufacturing. Category: energy and materials. Tools. Many traditional manufacturing methods shaped objects by removing material. Additive manufacturing reverses this logic by building objects layer by layer from digital models, effectively making fabrication directly dependent on information rather than tooling. Advances in materials science have significantly expanded printing beyond plastics into metals and composites, allowing for the creation of complex internal structures and lightweight geometries that would be impossible to machine. Meanwhile, bioprinting has extended these principles to living tissues, forever uniting the branches of manufacturing, biotechnology, and medicine. It's now theorized that replacement organs will be able to be printed in the very near future, eliminating the need for donors and the potential for rejection. Advanced lithography and microsystems. Category: energy and materials, electricity and electronics. As computation scaled, performance increasingly began to depend on how small and precise physical structures could be made. Advanced lithography pushed semiconductor fabrication into the nanometer realm, using extreme ultraviolet light to etch features so small they lie at the edge of physical possibility. This precision enabled denser, more efficient chips while supporting the rise of data centers, mobile computing, and artificial intelligence. Next, MEMS integrated sensors and actuators directly onto silicon, shrinking physical interaction into chip-scale systems. Soon after, lab-on-a-chip devices carried this miniaturization into chemistry and biology, collapsing laboratories into portable platforms. Satellite broadband constellations. Category: mathematics, information and media. Global connectivity once relied on terrestrial infrastructure, leaving vast regions of the world underserved. Today, satellite broadband constellations have emerged from the convergence of reusable rocketry, miniaturized satellites, and advanced signal processing. Low Earth orbit networks reduced latency while providing global coverage, enabling high-speed internet that operates independently of geography. These systems tie directly into other current technologies, such as autonomous vehicles, remote sensing, and global communication, while also introducing new strategic and security considerations in orbit. Advanced energy production. Category: energy and materials, transportation. Tell somebody that the solar panel was invented in 1954, and they will likely be shocked. However, imagine the surprise its inventors would feel to see where photovoltaic panels are today. As computing and automation spread through infrastructure, energy systems have begun shifting from centralized combustion toward distributed generation. Advances in photovoltaic materials have dramatically increased efficiency while reducing manufacturing costs, turning solar power into the most cost-effective energy source in the world. At the same time, lithium-ion batteries have enabled energy storage for mobile electronics and electric vehicles, decoupling power use from immediate generation. Right now, solid-state battery research is pushing toward higher energy density, improved safety, and longer lifespans. Advanced energy systems. Category: energy and materials, transportation. As renewable generation expanded, the challenge shifted from production to coordination. After all, energy systems require continuous sensing, prediction, and control to balance variable supply with real-time demand. Smart grids integrate sensors, communication networks, and machine learning to dynamically route electricity, stabilize frequency, and manage distributed storage. This way, power flow, regardless of its source, can become adaptive rather than fixed. This intelligence has allowed renewables, batteries, and nuclear systems to coexist efficiently, reducing reliance on fossil fuels while improving resilience. In the tech tree, advanced energy systems represent the moment power became programmable. As we move into the 21st century, our energy infrastructure will behave more like a responsive system than static hardware. Medicine 7. Category, medicine, AI, energy and materials. The 21st century has fused biology with computation, turning medicine into a data-driven engineering discipline. At the same time, genomics has revealed the complete genetic blueprints of humans and microbes, making disease traceable to molecular mechanisms rather than solely to symptoms. This hasn't eradicated disease, at least not yet. However, it does represent a major step toward that world-changing goal. Or perhaps we won't even need to. A new technology called CRISPR is enabling far more precise gene editing, transforming evolution from a blind process into a controllable one. Another revolutionary new medical advancement is mRNA vaccines, which can be designed extremely quickly and do not use a live virus. Rather, they work by teaching the body to make a harmless piece of a pathogen, triggering immunity. These vaccines have already demonstrated that immunity can be programmed rapidly at a global scale during the COVID-19 pandemic. With artificial intelligence dominating virtually every aspect of life since 2022, it should come as no surprise that AI and bioinformatics are being used to identify patterns in biological data beyond human perception. In fact, it's entirely possible that in the very near future, we will put our trust in 100% digital doctors who will monitor our health every second of our lives, which will most likely be far longer. Reusable rocketry. Category, transportation, energy and materials. For most of spaceflight history, rockets were disposable. This made access to orbit both rare and expensive. Reusable launch systems inverted this model by allowing major rocket components to be recovered and reconfigured for multiple uses. Co-technologies like autonomous guidance, precision landing, and advanced propulsion are currently enabling boosters to return safely after delivering their payloads. This has not only increased cadence and reliability, but also dramatically reduced the costs associated with spaceflight. As such, space exploration is transitioning from isolated national events to commercial logistics, a fact that may soon enable sustained orbital infrastructure. Smallsat platforms. Category, transportation, information and media. The term smallsat generally refers to satellites weighing less than 500 kilos, but already technology allows devices that are a mere fraction of that size. As with rockets, this miniaturization has transformed satellites from bespoke national assets into modular systems. Meanwhile, constellations have replaced single platforms, providing global imaging, weather monitoring and communication coverage. The best part is that many of these new systems are mostly autonomous, allowing them to operate successfully with minimal human oversight. GNSS augmentation. Category, measurement and standards, transportation. Early satellite navigation provided global position, but only within broad margins of error. GNSS augmentation systems have since added correction signals and precise timing references, reducing positional uncertainty from meters to centimeters. This increase in accuracy has proven decisive. Drones can now hold stable flight paths, robots can now operate safely around humans, and autonomous vehicles are increasingly able to navigate complex environments. Essentially, navigation no longer relies on satellites alone. By fusing GNSS with inertial sensors, cameras and AI, nav systems can remain accurate even when signals degrade or disappear. Weapons SIC. Category, weapons, AI, energy and materials, information and media. For centuries, the greatest thinkers predicted that war would be a thing of the past by the 21st century. Unfortunately, they were wrong. However, we are moving toward a type of warfare that emphasizes information, coordination, and speed over mass and firepower. One of the biggest changes is that global surveillance from satellites, drones, and ground sensors now feed continuous data into command networks. Artificial intelligence fuses these inputs into predictive models, identifying patterns, threats, and opportunities faster than human analysts can respond. As a result, decision loops that once took hours or days now compress into seconds or milliseconds. Autonomy extends this acceleration. Unmanned aerial, ground, and naval systems can operate persistently without risking human operators, all while coordinating through shared data and autonomy stacks. Meanwhile, drone swarms can replace single platforms, overwhelming defenses through numbers and adaptability rather than sheer size. Building upon the cyber warfare of the 90s, battlefields have continued to expand beyond physical space. Cyber operations can target infrastructure, communication networks, financial systems, and public perception, while electronic warfare elements can control the electromagnetic spectrum to disrupt radar, GPS, and communications. Perhaps the biggest adaptation has been the way information operations are able to weaponize social platforms and algorithms, blurring the line between military action and civilian life. This has made conflict continuous, often invisible, and largely deniable. That said, there's still plenty of interest in blowing things up back in the real world. In fact, advances in materials and propulsion have enabled the development of a new class of weapons, hypersonics. These half-vehicles, half-warheads, combine speed and maneuverability to compress response times and challenge existing defense systems. While we might not be in Star Wars or Star Trek territory yet, we do have directed energy weapons that are capable of converting electrical power directly into focused force, offering precision, low cost per engagement, and near-instant effects. At the individual level, soldiers are increasingly being integrated into the network through the use of smart optics, AI-assisted targeting, biometric monitoring, and encrypted communication links. Simultaneously, we're developing exoskeletons and lightweight composites to enhance endurance, reaction time, and strength. The best news to come out of the early 2000s is that even if we continue to fight wars, we might not need to fight them with humans anymore. As drones, robotics, and AI models improve, we take more steps closer to armies that don't need to spill blood to defeat the enemy. What branches the future holds? Given this incredible journey we've just gone on, what can we predict about the future? If you zoom out and look at the entire tech tree we've traced, a pattern becomes unmistakable. That is, technology doesn't just add new tools. Rather, it changes the kinds of problems humanity is capable of solving, and in turn, what kind of species we're allowed to become. For most of history, progress meant extending muscle, reach, and memory. Then the industrial age multiplied force. The digital age multiplied information, while the 21st century so far has been all about creating systems that can sense, learn, decide, and adapt in real time. And if you'll allow yourself to be indulged for just a few more minutes, we can offer some realistic data-backed predictions about where humanity might direct its efforts next. Artificial general intelligence. Every previous revolution has automated physical labor or clerical work, but artificial general intelligence threatens to automate thinking itself. Today's AI systems are narrow specialists, but their trajectory is clear. As models gain the ability to reason across domains, plan over long horizons, and learn continuously, they will begin to resemble general problem solvers rather than tools. An AGI would not just execute instructions, it would generate them. This would unlock AI scientists capable of discovering new physics, AI engineers capable of designing infrastructure, and AI strategists capable of running logistics more accurately than any human. With an AGI accelerating every other branch of the tech tree simultaneously, productivity could surge beyond anything seen before. This would not represent just another industrial revolution, but a civilizational hinge point beyond our greatest thinkers' wildest fantasies. Brain-computer interfaces. Brain-computer interfaces promise direct communication between neural activity and machines, bypassing keyboards, screens, and even speech. Early examples of this technology may serve to restore movement or vision, while later iterations could enhance memory, attention, and cognition itself. Over time, BCIs could blur the line between human and machine intelligence, as knowledge retrieval could feel like recall. Meanwhile, collaboration could happen at a mind-to-mind level, potentially eliminating the need for spoken language altogether. Such a technology would create a branching future in which augmented humans operate alongside non-augmented ones, potentially dividing the haves and have-nots into a completely separate species, if that term still even applies. Biotechnology, genetic engineering, and longevity. Genetic engineering is already turning evolution from a blind process into a deliberate one. Gene therapies are already promising cures for inherited diseases, and the big baddie of all ailments, cancer, is beginning to look less like a mystery and more like a potentially solvable software error. In the near future, aging itself might be reframed into something that can be slowed, reversed, or managed. Many medical professionals already predict that cellular rejuvenation, senescence control, and lifespan extension could push healthy human life well beyond current limits. If longevity is solved, even partially, it would reshape everything: careers, family structures, population dynamics, and personal identity. After all, a society where people expect to live 120 healthy years does not behave like one built around 70. Energy abundance. Nearly every limit in human history traces back to energy, but fusion and next-generation energy systems promise something radically new: abundance. Near-limitless clean power would make many of the problems currently threatening our planet almost trivial. Desalination. Simple. Energy independence. Universal. Like an AGI, having globally abundant energy would amplify every other branch of the tech tree. Before long, entire regions would be able to leapfrog development bottlenecks that once took centuries to overcome. Nanotechnology and programmable matter. Nanotechnology pushes control down to the smallest meaningful level, but it could still go further. At full maturity, nanotech could enable medical systems that repair cells from the inside out, or materials that change shape or properties on command. Imagine infrastructure that heals itself, or manufacturing processes that produce near-zero waste or byproducts. At this point, objects stop being static and become dynamic systems. Moreover, matter itself becomes responsive. When combined with AI design and energy abundance, this branch could make the physical world as editable as software: space infrastructure. Despite all our technology, humanity remains fragile because it is centralized on a single planet. Even if we achieve everything we've discussed so far, we would still be subject to the whims of Mother Nature, Earth's climate, and even the occasional meteor reset button. The expansion of space infrastructure, such as permanent lunar bases, Martian settlements, orbital manufacturing, and asteroid mining, would turn space from a destination into a domain. Long term, this would not be about exploration or prestige, but survival. The simple fact is that a multi-planet species is far harder to erase. Quantum computing. Quantum computing represents a class of computation that has not yet fully arrived, but whose implications are already reshaping long-term planning. By exploiting superposition and entanglement, future quantum machines are expected to tackle problem spaces that overwhelm classical computers, such as complex materials discovery, molecular simulation, climate modeling, and planetary optimization. This sounds even more impressive when you strip away the abstractions. If realized at scale, quantum systems could accelerate drug design by simulating chemistry directly, rather than approximating it. Because they could search vast solution spaces simultaneously, they could effectively compress years of computation into hours. As a result, entire fields may reorganize around what becomes computationally feasible. Extended reality and synthetic worlds. It may not be what science fiction fans want to hear, but the fact is that as physical constraints loosen, reality itself will become negotiable. Extended reality technologies could potentially create immersive environments for education, work, social life, and entertainment. Bitcoin has already shown us how digital economies can gain real stakes. What if we could partake in that economy in a place where identities are fluid, portable, and at least partially detached from physical bodies? For many people, meaningful experiences are already occurring in synthetic spaces. How many hours a week does the average person spend in Zoom meetings? If this concept gets pushed further, the tech tree could develop the first branches that exist entirely in a parallel world. Climate engineering. As climate risks intensify, large-scale intervention becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. Some predict that by 2050, the question will shift from whether humanity should influence the climate to whether it can afford not to. Put simply, climate engineering proposes deliberate actions to alter Earth systems in order to reduce warming or its impacts. Potential approaches include carbon removal, weather and precipitation modification, ocean chemistry control, and solar radiation modification, all of which would shift Earth from a largely self-regulating system to at least a partially managed one. The technical challenges, while immense, may prove solvable. Many proposed methods rely on known physics, chemistry, and industrial processes, simply scaled to levels that are obviously unprecedented. Of course, if and when the climate becomes adjustable, it would introduce a whole new set of potential risks to counter the obvious benefits. Convergence. Contrary to everything you've seen in this video, the most important thing about the future tech tree is not any single branch, but convergence. The future will most likely not unfold as isolated inventions arriving one at a time. Instead, technologies will compound and accelerate each other. Artificial intelligence will speed up biotechnology, which will reshape health and longevity, which will alter demographics, economics, and power. Meanwhile, energy abundance will amplify every system it touches. As we reach out into space, nanotechnology and neurotechnology will reach inward, modifying intelligence itself. In a few centuries or maybe even decades, we could reach the point where previously separate technologies, systems, or disciplines begin to merge and function as a unified whole. And while we might not be exactly human anymore by the time this happens, we will nonetheless have achieved what our ancestors set out to do when they first learned to harness fire. We will have extended the potential capabilities of our species as far as possible,